"We're expecting a son to carry on the Blackwood legacy," my husband announced at our family Thanksgiving dinner, his hand on his pregnant girlfriend's belly. What he didn't know was that by Christmas morning, his luxury hotel empire would legally belong to me, and had since the day we married. Let me tell you how I orchestrated the perfect takedown of a man who never bothered to read his own prenuptial agreement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The private dining room at the Goldcrest, my husband's flagship hotel, felt particularly stifling that evening, despite its soaring 20-foot ceilings and panoramic views of the city skyline. I'd spent weeks planning this Thanksgiving dinner, selecting the vintage crystal champagne that James favored, arranging for Chef Michelle to prepare a heritage turkey with all the traditional fixings, and ensuring every detail from the hand-calligraphed place cards to the centerpiece of autumn botanicals was immaculate. 20 years of marriage deserved nothing less, even if I suspected it might be our last holiday together. The Goldcrest Penthouse restaurant had always been our family's private sanctuary. Its warm amber lighting cast a honeyed glow across the antique mahogany table that had once belonged to James's grandfather, the founder of Blackwood Hospitality Group. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering cityscape below, a view that James often claimed was worth more per square foot than any other real estate in the metropolitan area. Tonight, those same windows reflected our small gathering, our twin daughters home from their first semester at Princeton, James's widowed mother Eleanor, his younger brother Thomas with his wife Vivian, and me, the woman who had spent 2 decades building and protecting the Blackwood legacy while my husband enjoyed the fruits of our labors. I adjusted the arrangement of Venetian crystal glasses, an anniversary gift from James back when he still remembered such occasions, and wondered if anyone else noticed how the faceted crystal caught the light and scattered rainbows across the imported linen tablecloth. These small details had always mattered to me, the little touches of elegance and precision that had become my signature in both personal and professional realms. James used to tease me about my obsessive attention to minutiae before he came to rely on it, before it became the foundation upon which he built his reputation for luxury and excellence. The scent of roasting turkey and spiced cranberries wafted through the room as servers discreetly arranged silver serving dishes along the sideboard. Our family tradition had always been to serve Thanksgiving dinner precisely at 7 o'clock, a nod to James's grandfather's military punctuality. It was now 7:15, and James had yet to arrive. The girls were growing restless, checking their phones and exchanging glances that spoke volumes about their father's increasing unreliability. Eleanor, ever the proper matriarch, maintained her composure, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed her disappointment. Thomas and Vivian made stilted conversation about their recent trip to the Blackwood property in Aspen, carefully avoiding any mention of James's absence. "Perhaps we should begin without him," Eleanor finally suggested, her voice carrying that practiced blend of politeness and authority that had guided the Blackwood family through countless social crises. "Just 5 more minutes," I replied, maintaining my poised smile. He texted that he was running late, something about a meeting with potential investors. What I didn't share was the rest of his message, bringing someone special, important announcement. After 20 years of marriage, I'd developed a finely tuned sense for James's surprises, and this one had set off alarm bells the moment I'd read his text. The timing was too perfect, too aligned with what my private investigator had uncovered 3 months ago. James had always had a flair for dramatic timing, but tonight's performance promised to be particularly memorable, though not in the way he anticipated. Through the frosted glass doors of the private dining room, I could see the silhouettes approaching, one tall and confident, unmistakably James, and beside him, a distinctly feminine figure whose profile revealed what I had suspected but had not yet confirmed. I took a deep breath and smoothed the front of my Chanel dress, a deep burgundy that I knew complemented my complexion and, more importantly, projected the image of confident control. 20 years in the hospitality industry had taught me the value of appropriate attire. It was armor, a visual statement of intent and position. "They're here," I announced quietly, just as the doors swung open to reveal my husband of 2 decades, his hand possessively placed on the small of his companion's back. Olivia Chen, the 29-year-old director of marketing for Blackwood's Asian expansion, wore a cream-colored dress that did nothing to disguise the gentle swell of her pregnant belly. The room fell silent as every head turned toward the doorway, the collective intake of breath almost audible in the sudden stillness. James's smile never wavered as he guided Olivia into the room, either oblivious to or dismissive of the shock rippling through his family. At 53, he still cut an impressive figure, tall and distinguished with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to commanding attention. The bespoke Tom Ford suit he wore had been my selection earlier this year, a fact that struck me as oddly poignant in the moment. "Sorry we're late," James announced, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone he'd perfected in boardrooms across the globe. "Traffic was a nightmare. But we're here now, and I have someone very special I'd like you all to meet." Eleanor's knuckles whitened around her linen napkin. The twins, Audrey and Amelia, exchanged identical looks of dawning comprehension. Thomas studied his water glass with sudden, intense interest, while Vivian's eyes darted between James and me, measuring, calculating, preparing for the social fallout. "Everyone," James continued, either missing or ignoring the tension that had transformed the room. "This is Olivia Chen, our brilliant marketing director for the Asian market. She's recently become much more than a colleague to me, and we have some wonderful news to share tonight." Olivia offered a tentative smile, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her stomach, a gesture so primally feminine, so fundamentally declarative, that no verbal announcement was necessary. The statement had been made in that simple touch, the evidence of my husband's betrayal displayed for all to see. "As you can probably tell," James said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "Olivia and I are expecting a son in March, the first male heir to the Blackwood name in this generation." The subtle dig at Thomas's 3 daughters wasn't lost on anyone at the table. The succession of the Blackwood empire had always been a point of tension between the brothers, with James frequently lamenting the lack of a male heir to continue the family name and business. Now he stood before us, proudly announcing that he had solved this problem through infidelity and dishonor. I rose from my seat with practiced grace, years of hosting diplomatic business functions finally serving their ultimate purpose. The weight of the moment might have crushed a woman less prepared, but I had been anticipating this confrontation for 97 days, ever since receiving the first surveillance photos from my investigator showing James and Olivia entering a private doctor's office specializing in obstetrics. "Olivia," I said, extending my hand, "how lovely to finally meet you properly. Please, come sit beside me. You must be exhausted in your condition." The look of confusion that flashed across James's face was just the first note in the symphony of revelations I had orchestrated for this evening. He had clearly expected tears, accusations, perhaps a scene, the kind of emotional outburst that he could later characterize as hysteria, that he could use to justify his actions to family, friends, and business associates. What he had never understood about me, despite 2 decades of marriage, was that I had learned long ago to transform emotion into strategy. As I guided Olivia to the seat beside mine, the seat traditionally reserved for honored guests, I caught Eleanor's eye. The slight nod she offered might have been imperceptible to others, but to me, it was confirmation. The Blackwood matriarch, despite her strict adherence to traditional values, had always prized loyalty above all else. In that small gesture, she had declared her position in the battle that was about to unfold. "James," I said calmly, "why don't you sit across from us? I believe we have much to discuss over dinner." I signaled to the hovering staff, "Please serve the first course, and bring Mr. Blackwood his champagne. The Cristal 2008. I believe that's still your preference? As James took his seat, momentarily displaced by my unexpected composure, I reached for my handbag, an elegant Hermes piece that had been a gift from his mother on our 15th anniversary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From its interior, I withdrew a slim leather portfolio embossed with the Blackwood Hospitality Group logo. "Before we begin," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the tension-filled room, "perhaps we should discuss the future you envision for the Blackwood Empire, James. After all, with a new heir on the way, I imagine you have grand plans for the legacy you intend to leave." Not What James didn't realize as he reached for his champagne with a smirk beginning to form on his lips was that I had spent the last 3 months preparing for this moment. Every late night he thought I was reviewing hotel renovation plans or organizing charity events, I had actually been meeting with the company's original attorneys, men loyal to his father who had drafted the complex ownership agreements 3 decades ago, documents that James had signed but never fully understood. The stage was set, the players were in position, and as our family's traditional Thanksgiving dinner began, none of them, not even James, could anticipate how completely the Blackwood Empire was about to be transformed by dessert. Before we dive deeper into what happened next at that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I want to take a moment to connect with you personally. If you're watching this video right now, chances are you've either experienced betrayal yourself or know someone who has. The feeling of having the rug pulled out from under you by someone you trusted implicitly. It creates a wound that cuts deeper than almost any other. I'm sharing my story today, not just for catharsis or views, but because I believe there's power in knowing you're not alone. The isolation that follows discovery of betrayal can be almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. So, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if any part of this story resonates with your own experience. Your story matters too. While you're at it, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I'm releasing a special follow-up video about the legal framework that protected me and how you can safeguard your own interests in any relationship, business or personal. The information I wish I'd had 20 years ago might just save you decades of regret. Now, let's return to that tense Thanksgiving dinner table, where the turkey wasn't the only thing about to be carved up. The first course, a butternut, squash bisque with truffle oil and crispy sage, arrived with impeccable timing, momentarily shifting attention from the dramatic situation unfolding around us. The twins, Audrey and Amelia, both perfect reflections of me at 19 with their honey blonde hair and analytical eyes, maintained remarkably composed expressions. I'd raised them to be resilient, observant, and strategic, qualities that served them well in this moment of family crisis. James cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance by my calm demeanor. He'd expected a scene, tears perhaps, or at minimum, cold anger. My cordial welcome to his pregnant mistress had disrupted his script before he'd even begun his performance. "Victoria," he started, using my full name as he always did when attempting to establish authority. "I realize this comes as a shock, but I hoped we could all be adults about the situation." I smiled slightly, taking a deliberate sip of the Montrachet that the sommelier had selected to accompany the first course. "Nothing shocks me anymore, James, especially not after reviewing the quarterly reports from our Singapore property last month." His brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his facade. The Singapore hotel's financial irregularities were something he believed only he and the CFO had access to. He didn't know that, as a silent board member, I received every report, every audit, every projection. This was just my opening move. A subtle indication that I knew far more than he realized. "The Singapore property is performing adequately," he responded with practiced smoothness. "Some initial setbacks with the launch, but Olivia's marketing strategy has positioned us well for Q1 next year." Olivia straightened at the mention of her professional contribution, clearly eager to steer the conversation towards safer territory. "We've secured partnerships with 3 of the top luxury tour operators in China," she offered, her voice carrying the slight musical quality of someone who grew up bilingual. "The occupancy projections for Lunar New Year are extremely promising." "How fascinating," I replied, turning my attention fully to her. "You must be very proud of your work there. The Blackwood Group has always valued innovative thinking. It's the foundation of our success." "Our success," James emphasized, reaching for his champagne. 20 years of building on my father's legacy. When my son takes over someday, he'll have quite the empire to inherit." Eleanor's spoon clinked sharply against her soup bowl. The closest thing to an outburst the dignified matriarch would permit herself in company. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I recognized the subtle signal we'd established decades ago when I first joined the family. She was ready to follow my lead, wherever this evening might go. "Speaking of legacies," Thomas interjected, his voice carrying that slightly hesitant quality it had held since childhood when standing up to his domineering older brother. "Perhaps this isn't the most appropriate setting for such announcements. James, the girls are adults now," James dismissed, barely glancing at his daughters. "And they should understand how the real world works. Business and pleasure sometimes overlap, and arrangements must evolve accordingly." Arrangements. How telling that he would reduce 20 years of marriage to an arrangement that had simply run its course. I watched Audrey's fingers tighten around her water glass, her Princeton education in business ethics clearly at odds with her father's cavalier attitude. Amelia's expression remained carefully neutral, though I recognized the slight tilt of her head that indicated she was already calculating, analyzing, preparing, so much like me at her age. "And what sort of arrangement do you envision going forward, James?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough warmth to confuse him. This wasn't the confrontation he'd prepared for. He leaned back, relaxing marginally as he assumed we were moving into negotiation territory, his comfort zone. "I've had Matthews draw up some papers. Very generous terms, considering the circumstances. You'll keep the Hamptons house, of course, and a reasonable annual stipend. I imagine you'll want to step back from hotel operations, but perhaps we can find you something suitable with the charitable foundation." The sheer audacity of his presumption was almost admirable. In his mind, he'd already resolved everything, divested himself of an aging wife, secured a younger replacement who carried his male heir, and neatly relegated me to a powerless position while he maintained complete control of the empire we'd built together. "How thoughtful," I murmured, signaling to the staff to clear the first course. Though I'm curious about Mr. Matthews's involvement, considering he's not actually the Blackwood Group's legal counsel of record. Another flicker of confusion crossed James's face. "Matthews has handled all my legal affairs for the past 5 years. "Your personal legal affairs, perhaps," I corrected gently, "but not the corporate structure. Rothman and Associates still maintain that responsibility, as stipulated in your father's original incorporation documents." The twins exchanged a quick glance, recognizing the name of their grandfather's law firm, a detail they wouldn't have expected me to know, much less mention at the Thanksgiving table. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, aware that the conversation had moved into territory he'd always deliberately avoided. The operation of the family business had been James's domain since their father's death, with Thomas content to enjoy the benefits without shouldering the responsibilities. "Rothman is semi-retired," James dismissed, though I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Matthews has been handling day-to-day operations for years." "For some operations," I agreed pleasantly as the main course arrived. Heritage turkey, carved tableside, accompanied by chestnut stuffing, bourbon-glazed sweet potatoes, and haricots verts with caramelized shallots. Though not, interestingly, for the trust administration or the holding company structure. James set down his champagne flute a bit too forcefully, causing the crystal to sing a high, tense note. I wasn't aware you had such interest in corporate structure, Victoria. You've always been more focused on the design aspects of our properties. A woman contains multitudes, James, I replied, nodding appreciation to the server who placed a perfect portion of turkey on my plate. And 20 years is a long time to observe and learn. Olivia glanced between us, clearly sensing the undercurrents but unable to decipher their meaning. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach in an unconscious gesture that might have wounded me under different circumstances. Now I felt only a distant pity for her. She was merely a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand, a game that had begun long before she entered the picture. If we could return to more pleasant conversation, Eleanor suggested, her voice carrying the authority that had guided the Blackwood family through decades of both public triumph and private turmoil. Audrey, tell us about your economic policy seminar. Your professor is a Nobel laureate, I believe? It was a masterful redirect, giving everyone at the table an opportunity to retreat from the precipice we'd been approaching. Audrey seized the opening with the social grace she'd inherited from both her grandmother and me, launching into an animated description of her coursework that required no real engagement from anyone listening. I caught Eleanor's eye and offered a slight nod of appreciation. She understood the value of timing as well as I did. The revelations I had planned would unfold according to my carefully orchestrated schedule, not in response to James's provocations. As the conversation shifted to safer topics, I watched James visibly relax, mistaking the temporary reprieve for surrender. He turned his attention to Olivia, his hand occasionally resting possessively on her arm as he guided her through the intricacies of Blackwood family dynamics, introducing anecdotes and context designed to establish his central importance to every aspect of family history and business success. What he didn't realize, what he had never fully appreciated, was that for 20 years, I had been the silent architect of that success, the shadow partner whose attention to detail and strategic vision had transformed a modest collection of luxury hotels into a global hospitality empire. Behind every major acquisition, every successful renovation, every innovative service concept that had become the Blackwood signature, my influence had shaped outcomes while James took center stage and claimed the credit. The staff began preparing for dessert service, individual pumpkin soufflés with spiced crème anglaise, a tradition I'd introduced our first Thanksgiving as a married couple. I checked my watch discreetly, counting down to the moment when the first domino would fall in the sequence I'd arranged so carefully over the past 3 months. In exactly 12 minutes, as the soufflés were being served, James's phone would ring with a call he couldn't ignore. The first note in the symphony of revelations that would reshape not just our family dinner, but the entire future of the Blackwood empire. As the staff prepared the dining room for dessert service, I observed how James leaned in closer to Olivia, his voice dropping to that intimate register he'd once reserved for me in the early years of our marriage. He was explaining some apparently amusing anecdote about the original acquisition of the Goldcrest, gesturing expansively as he described his visionary decision to purchase the struggling property and transform it into the flagship of the Blackwood portfolio. The previous owners had no concept of luxury positioning, he told her, his hand now resting casually on her lower back. They were running it like a glorified business hotel. I saw the potential immediately. The bones were there. For something truly exceptional. What he conveniently omitted was that I had been the one to identify the property, research its potential, and create the entire repositioning strategy. I had spent weeks interviewing designers, chefs, and service consultants to craft the vision that would become the Blackwood signature experience. James had merely signed the papers and accepted the accolades when the revitalized Goldcrest became the most sought-after reservation in the city. This pattern of appropriation had become so familiar over the years that I had stopped correcting him, both publicly and privately. His narrative of singular genius had become the accepted history, not just with the press and our social circle, but eventually within the family itself. Even the twins had grown up absorbing the mythology of their father's business acumen, though they'd occasionally glimpsed enough of my behind-the-scenes work to question the official version. The Singapore property was actually following Victoria's design concept, wasn't it, Dad? Amelia asked, her voice carrying that deceptively innocent tone she'd perfected since childhood when asking questions she already knew the answers to. I remember Mom flying to Kyoto to meet with that famous Japanese architect. What was his name? Tanaka, I supplied quietly. Hiroshi Tanaka. James waved a dismissive hand. Victoria handled some of the aesthetic details, of course, but the vision and execution were mine. He turned to Olivia with a conspiratorial smile. My wife has always had an eye for decoration, though sometimes her ideas need to be reined in for practical considerations. Decoration. 20 years of architectural innovation, brand development, and strategic positioning reduced to decoration. I met Eleanor's gaze across the table and saw the flash of indignation she quickly masked. She, more than anyone, knew the truth of my contributions to the Blackwood empire. Tanaka-san won the Pritzker Prize last year, didn't he? Thomas asked, his voice carrying an unusual edge. Quite a coup to have him design the Singapore property. It was perhaps the first time in years I'd heard him directly challenge the narrative James had constructed. Yes, he did, Olivia confirmed eagerly, seemingly relieved to contribute to the conversation in her professional capacity. His design for Blackwood Singapore has been featured in Architectural Digest and Hospitality Design. It's become a case study at several design schools. Thanks largely to your marketing efforts, I'm sure, James said, patting her hand affectionately. The gesture was calculated to remind everyone at the table of their relationship, while simultaneously dismissing the significance of the architectural achievement. I observed the fleeting shadow that crossed Olivia's face, the first indication that perhaps she wasn't entirely comfortable with her role in this drama. She was young, ambitious, and clearly talented at her job. Under different circumstances, I might have mentored her, guided her career within the Blackwood organization. Now she was carrying my husband's child and being unwittingly positioned as my replacement, both personally and professionally. The Tanaka design was revolutionary for the brand, I noted, keeping my tone conversational. It established the architectural signature that's now being implemented across all the Asian properties. I turned to Olivia. I imagine that gives you a strong foundation for the regional marketing strategy. Before she could respond, James's phone chimed with a notification. He glanced down, frowning slightly as he read the message. "Excuse me," he said, rising from his chair. "I need to take this. Won't be a moment." As he stepped away from the table to make his call near the panoramic windows, I noted the exact time on the elegant Patek Philippe watch that had been a gift from Eleanor on my 40th birthday. Right on schedule. The first piece of my carefully orchestrated plan was sliding into place. "Olivia," I said, turning my full attention to the young woman who now sat awkwardly beside me, suddenly deprived of James's protective presence. "Tell me about yourself. James has been surprisingly reticent about your background." Her discomfort was palpable as she glanced toward James, who was now engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly tense phone conversation. "There's not much to tell, really," she offered. "I grew up in San Francisco, studied marketing at Stanford, and joined Blackwood 3 years ago to help launch the Asian expansion." "Stanford is an excellent school," I remarked. "I'm an alumna myself, MBA, class of 2003. Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't realize James never mentioned you were business educated." "There are many things James has chosen not to mention over the years," I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Tell me, when did you first become involved with the Singapore property development?" "About 18 months ago," she answered, her professional confidence returning as we moved into familiar territory. "I was initially brought in to develop the pre-opening marketing strategy, but my role expanded as the project progressed. 18 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with what my investigator had uncovered. Their affair had begun shortly after Olivia was assigned to work directly with James on the Singapore launch. A textbook case of workplace power dynamics exploited by a man who should have known better. "And your relationship with James?" I asked, my voice dropping just enough to make the question feel intimate rather than accusatory. Olivia glanced again toward James, who remained engrossed in his increasingly animated phone conversation. "It evolved naturally through our work together," she offered cautiously. "I never intended, that is, I didn't know he was planning to bring you to Thanksgiving dinner and announce your pregnancy to his family," I supplied when she faltered. "Yes, that would be rather consistent with James's approach to significant life changes. He's always preferred dramatic gestures over thoughtful conversations." Across the table, Audrey made a sound that might have been a stifled laugh. My daughter had witnessed enough of her father's grand pronouncements over the years to recognize the pattern. "I want you to know," Olivia said, lowering her voice further, "I never meant to cause pain. When things started between us, James told me the marriage was already over in all but name. He said you had an understanding. The familiar lie of unfaithful husbands throughout history. I wondered briefly how many other women had heard the same explanation over the years. James's infidelities hadn't been frequent, but neither was this the first time." "An understanding," I repeated softly. "How convenient that must have been." "For him." Olivia flushed, her hand moving again to her stomach in that protective gesture that spoke volumes. "I wouldn't have become involved if I'd known." "That he was lying?" I suggested gently. "Or that he would put you in this impossible position?" I gestured around the table. Pregnant and facing his family across the Thanksgiving table before any divorce was even discussed? Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I felt an unexpected surge of compassion. Olivia was not the villain in this story, merely another woman who had fallen for James's practiced charm and calculated attention. The real betrayal lay not in his infidelity, but in the decades of dismissal, appropriation, and disrespect that had preceded it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and the genuine regret in her voice only strengthened my resolve to proceed with my plan. This young woman and her unborn child were, in many ways, just as much James's victims as I had been, drawn into his orbit with promises and flattery, only to be used as props in his carefully constructed narrative of success. At the window, James's voice rose enough for us to catch fragments of his conversation. "Impossible. Must be a mistake. Check again." His normally confident posture had stiffened, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Eleanor cleared her throat delicately. "Perhaps this would be a good time to serve dessert," she suggested, her years as the Blackwood matriarch having taught her the value of maintaining normal routines in the midst of family crises. The staff responded immediately, bringing in the individual pumpkin soufflés with their accompanying sauce. The presentation was exquisite, each golden dome rising perfectly above its ramekin, dusted with powdered sugar and garnished with a caramelized sage leaf. "These look wonderful," Thomas commented, seizing the opportunity to move conversation to safer ground. "Victoria, your attention to detail with the menu is always impeccable." "Thank you, Thomas," I replied, accepting the compliment with a nod. I believe traditions are worth maintaining, even in challenging circumstances. As we began the dessert course, James returned to the table, his expression now visibly troubled. He slid his phone into his pocket and resumed his seat without comment, though his earlier bravado had dimmed considerably. "Is everything all right?" Olivia asked, her concern evident. "Fine," he replied tersely. "Just a small issue with the Dubai property that needs attention." I took a deliberate bite of my soufflé, savoring both the delicate spiced sweetness and the knowledge that the small issue was actually the first tremor in what would soon become a seismic shift in James's carefully constructed world. The call had come from the Dubai financial authorities, questioning certain discrepancies in the property's ownership documentation. Discrepancies I had strategically highlighted through an anonymous tip 3 days ago. Dubai has been performing exceptionally well this quarter, I noted casually, especially considering the regulatory challenges in that market. James's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he studied my face. For perhaps the first time that evening, he was truly seeing me, not as the decorative wife he'd outgrown, but as someone who might possess information he didn't control. The regulatory environment is complex, he replied cautiously, but nothing we haven't navigated successfully before. Of course, I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. Though I've always found that transparency is the best approach with international financial authorities. Wouldn't you agree? The double meaning wasn't lost on him. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he considered, perhaps for the first time, whether I might know about the offshore accounts, the tax structures, the carefully disguised fund movements that had characterized his management of the Blackwood Group's international holdings. Most business matters are too nuanced for simple transparency, he countered, reaching for his water glass rather than the champagne. Context and complexity require sophisticated handling. Indeed, they do, I agreed pleasantly, which is why I've always appreciated Rothman's thorough approach to documentation. Old school, perhaps, but remarkably effective for preserving what matters. The mention of his father's attorney again seemed to unsettle him. James had systematically distanced himself from the old guard after his father's death, bringing in his own people, establishing his own systems. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to confirm, was exactly what authorities those original corporate documents had preserved. Dessert continued in tense silence, the earlier flow of conversation now dammed by the undercurrents of James's phone call and my cryptic comments. The twins exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere but unable to decipher its meaning. Thomas studied his soufflé with unnecessary concentration, while Vivian watched the dynamics with the keen observation of someone who had married into the family, rather than being born to its complications. Only Eleanor seemed truly at ease, enjoying her dessert with the serene composure of someone who had witnessed decades of family drama and knew that resolution, however painful, always eventually came. As the staff cleared the dessert plates, James cleared his throat. I think it's time we discuss the practical aspects of the situation, he announced, attempting to reclaim control of the narrative. Victoria and I will be divorcing, and Olivia, and I will be married before the baby arrives in March. I've already begun transitioning Victoria's responsibilities within the organization to ensure minimal disruption. The presumption was breathtaking, that he had the authority to unilaterally remove me from the company, that he could simply announce life-altering decisions as if they were foregone conclusions, that everyone at the table would simply accept. His pronouncements without question. 20 years ago, they might have. 20 years ago, I might have as well. But that was before I discovered exactly what James's father had written into those original incorporation documents, and exactly who had legally controlled the Blackwood Hospitality Group since the day of our wedding. James leaned back in his chair, swirling the remains of his champagne with the practiced nonchalance of a man accustomed to having the final word. The momentary discomfort from his phone call seemed to have passed, replaced by his default state of unearned confidence. I've instructed Matthews to prepare a comprehensive settlement package, he announced, his tone suggesting he was bestowing a great generosity rather than fulfilling a legal obligation. Given your contributions as my wife, Victoria, I think you'll find the terms more than fair. The calculated emphasis on my wife versus any acknowledgement of my professional role spoke volumes. In James's worldview, I had been an accessory to his success. Decorative, occasionally useful, but ultimately replaceable. a sentiment he was now making painfully explicit. As I mentioned, he continued, setting down his glass and steepling his fingers in that gesture I'd seen countless times in boardroom presentations. You'll retain the Hamptons property. I know how much you enjoy your garden there, and it seems a fitting venue for your retirement. Retirement, at 45. As though my career, my expertise, my vision had all been some charming hobby to keep me occupied until I gracefully exited the stage at his convenience. How considerate, I murmured, reaching for my water glass. And what arrangements have you made for my equity in the company? Something flickered across his face. Annoyance, perhaps, at my failure to simply express gratitude for his magnanimity. You'll receive a generous annual stipend drawn from the family trust, he replied smoothly. Structured as consultancy fees for tax purposes, naturally. Naturally, I echoed, maintaining my composed exterior while noting how thoroughly he had convinced himself that the empire we'd built together was his alone to allocate. And the board has approved this restructuring? James waved a dismissive hand. The board serves at my discretion, Victoria. They'll ratify whatever decisions I deem appropriate for the company's future. Across the table, Thomas winced slightly at his brother's naked display of autocratic thinking. Even he, who had deliberately remained disengaged from the family business operations, recognized the arrogance in James's proclamation. Dad, Audrey interjected, her voice carrying the precision of someone choosing her words with extreme care. I thought grandfather's incorporation documents included specific provisions about board independence? I suppressed a smile at my daughter's strategic intervention. Her business ethics professor at Princeton would have been proud of both her recall and her timing. James's expression hardened momentarily before he manufactured an indulgent smile. Your corporate governance textbooks provide excellent theoretical frameworks, sweetheart. But the practical reality of family businesses operates differently. The board understands their role is advisory, not directorial. Fascinating interpretation, I commented lightly. I wonder what Judge Carlton would make of that perspective. The mention of the famously stern corporate law judge, who had ruled against several high-profile CEOs in recent governance disputes, caused James's smile to falter slightly. Legal technicalities aside, he continued, redirecting the conversation, I've ensured everyone will be well provided for through this transition, including you, Victoria. How reassuring, I replied. Though I'm curious about your plans for the European expansion. Will you be proceeding with the Paris acquisition? The question was deliberately crafted to sound innocent while probing a sensitive issue. The historic Parisian hotel I'd been negotiating to acquire for the past year represented my most ambitious project yet, and one James had consistently opposed as too expensive and too complex. The Paris property is being reassessed, he answered, carefully. The current market conditions suggest we may need to postpone major capital investments. What market conditions? Olivia asked, professional interest momentarily overriding her discomfort. The European luxury sector is projected to grow by 8% next year. All our market research indicates the timing is optimal for expansion. I watched with quiet satisfaction as James struggled to navigate this unexpected challenge from his pregnant girlfriend. He hadn't anticipated that her professional expertise might complicate his narrative. There are broader strategic considerations beyond market projections, he responded, his tone carrying that patronizing quality he adopted when his judgment was questioned. The board and I are evaluating our global footprint with a focus on maximizing returns across the entire portfolio. The board, I repeated thoughtfully, including Rothman as counsel or just Matthews? James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Corporate structure discussions aren't appropriate for the Thanksgiving table, Victoria. Perhaps we should return to more festive topics. On the contrary, Eleanor interjected with regal composure, I find corporate governance absolutely fascinating, particularly when it concerns the family legacy my husband spent his life building." The subtle rebuke in her words was unmistakable. Eleanor had never directly challenged James's management of the Blackwood Group since her husband's death, maintaining the traditional separation between family and business that had characterized the previous generation. Her intervention now signaled a significant shift, one that clearly took James by surprise. "Mother," he began, his tone hovering between deference and impatience, "the business landscape has evolved considerably since Father's day. The structures and strategies that served the company then would be hopelessly outdated now." "Evolution is inevitable," Eleanor agreed with a slight incline of her head. "Though I've always believed that principles should remain constant, even as practices adapt to changing circumstances. Your father was particularly adamant about maintaining the core values upon which he built the company." James's expression tightened further. He had never appreciated being reminded of his father's principles, particularly when they conflicted with his own more expedient approach to business. "The Blackwood Group's success under my leadership speaks for itself," he stated flatly. 7 new properties, market capitalization tripled, brand recognition expanded to 3 continents. "I think Father would have approved of those results, whatever methods achieved them. Results without integrity are merely numbers on a balance sheet," Eleanor replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "But then, you always did prefer quantifiable metrics to qualitative values." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. In all the years of family gatherings, I had never witnessed Eleanor so directly challenge her eldest son's perspective. James appeared momentarily at a loss, unused to having his authority questioned by the family matriarch. Olivia shifted awkwardly beside me, clearly unnerved by the undercurrents she couldn't fully decipher. The twins exchanged another of their silent communications. A raised eyebrow from Audrey met with a slight nod from Amelia. They sensed the power dynamics shifting, but couldn't yet see the pattern those shifts were forming. James recovered quickly, his momentary discomfort masked beneath a veneer of magnanimous tolerance. "Different generations naturally have different priorities," he said smoothly. "Father built something remarkable from the ground up. My contribution has been to modernize and expand that foundation, and my son will inherit a global enterprise ready for the next evolution." The presumption in his words hung in the air, the automatic assumption that his unborn son would eventually control the Blackwood Empire, regardless of the existence of his 2 highly capable daughters or any other consideration. "Fascinating how you've planned the next 50 years of corporate succession based on a child who hasn't even been born," I observed, "particularly given the regulatory challenges emerging in Dubai." His eyes narrowed at my second reference to the Dubai situation. "A minor administrative issue that will be resolved by morning," he dismissed, though the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. "Of course," I agreed pleasantly, though in my experience, regulatory authorities rarely make inquiries without substantial cause, particularly regarding ownership structures. For the first time that evening, genuine alarm flashed across James's face before he could suppress it. "Your experience with international regulatory bodies is somewhat limited, Victoria," he countered, his tone deliberately condescending. "These matters require specialized expertise." "How fortunate, then, that I've had the benefit of excellent advisors," I replied, maintaining eye contact as I reached for my handbag. "Including Gerald Rothman, who sends his regards, by the way. We had quite an illuminating meeting last month." James stilled completely, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. "You met with Rothman? Why?" The question emerged sharper than he'd intended, the first real crack in his composed facade. Gerald Rothman had been his father's closest confidant and legal architect of the original Blackwood corporate structure, a structure James had spent years trying to modernize, simplify, and ultimately control more directly. "Professional curiosity," I answered lightly. "It's remarkable how much institutional knowledge resides with the old guard. Gerald was particularly helpful in explaining the nuances of the Class B ownership shares and their voting rights. The color drained from James's face so rapidly that even Olivia noticed, her brow furrowing with concern as she placed a hand on his arm. "James, are you all right?" He ignored her, his attention fixed entirely on me. "The Class B shares are a legacy structure," he stated, his voice tightly controlled. "Their practical application was superseded by the reorganization 5 years ago." That's where things get interesting," I replied, removing a slim leather portfolio from my handbag. According to the original incorporation documents, which Gerald helpfully provided, any reorganization affecting the Class B shares requires unanimous consent from all registered holders. "Which was obtained," James snapped, his patience visibly fraying. The board minutes reflect your presentation of a reorganization plan," I interrupted gently, "and a vote approving implementation subject to all necessary consents being secured. But there's no record of those consents ever being properly documented." I paused, allowing the implication to sink in. Specifically, my consent, as the registered holder of 60% of the Class B shares since our marriage. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the staff, moving discreetly around the perimeter of the dining room, seemed to freeze at the bombshell I had just detonated. "That's impossible," James finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Class B shares were assigned to the family trust. Father arranged it before his death." "Almost correct," I acknowledged. "Your father did indeed arrange the assignment of the Class B shares, but not to the family trust." I opened the portfolio and removed a single document, sliding it across the table toward him. He assigned them directly to me as a wedding gift. His letter explaining his decision makes for rather illuminating reading. James stared at the document as though it might burst into flames. His hand, when he finally reached for it, trembled almost imperceptibly, the first visible manifestation of genuine fear I had seen from him in our 20 years together. As he unfolded his father's letter, I watched the realization dawn across, his face dismantling 2 decades of unearned confidence piece by devastating piece. The antique Waterford crystal decanter on the sideboard caught the light as a server moved past, sending prismatic reflections dancing across the hand-painted silk wallpaper. I had personally selected that wallpaper, a custom design featuring subtle gold-threaded cherry blossoms against a midnight blue background during the Goldcrest's last renovation. It had been a point of contention between James and me. He had favored something more conventional, something that wouldn't challenge the guests' expectations of luxury. "People aren't paying 5 figures a night for avant-garde design statements," he'd argued at the time. "They want recognizable opulence." But I had persisted, knowing that true luxury in the modern market wasn't about gilt and marble, but about distinctive, curated experiences that couldn't be replicated. The cherry blossom wallpaper had since been featured in 3 major design magazines and become something of a signature for the Blackwood aesthetic, unique, elegant, and subtly subversive of traditional expectations. How fitting that this backdrop of my creative vision against James's resistance now framed his moment of reckoning. As he read his father's letter, the color gradually returned to his face. Not the healthy flush of relief, but the ruddy hue of mounting anger. His fingers tightened on the heavy stationery, crinkling the edges of what had remained pristine for 2 decades in my personal safe. "This has to be a forgery," he finally declared, slapping the letter down on the table. "My father would never have arranged such a thing without informing me." I smiled slightly, having anticipated this exact reaction. "The original is in Gerald Rothman's possession, along with the formal assignment of shares, both notarized and registered with the corporate secretary at the time of our marriage. I only keep a copy for my personal records." The twins watched, this exchange with identical expressions of fascinated calculation. They had grown up observing their father's corporate maneuvering, his strategic aggression masked as business acumen. Now they were witnessing something altogether different, their mother's long game finally revealed. Even if this document were legitimate, James continued, his voice tight with controlled fury, the subsequent reorganizations would have superseded any original arrangement. The Class B shares were effectively neutralized in the 2015 restructuring. That's an interesting legal theory, I replied mildly, though not one supported by Delaware corporate law, as Rothman has extensively documented. Any attempt to dilute or neutralize the Class B shares without explicit written consent from the majority holder constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. Section 273. 4 of the corporate charter is quite specific on this point. James's jaw worked as he processed this information. The 2015 restructuring had been his masterpiece, a complex reorganization that had consolidated his operational control while theoretically maintaining the original ownership structure. He had presented it to the board as a modernization necessary for international expansion, a streamlining of outdated corporate governance. What he hadn't realized, what his new counsel Matthews had either missed or deliberately obscured, was that the original incorporation documents included tripwire protections specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of power consolidation, without the knowledge and consent of all key stakeholders. The board approved the reorganization unanimously, he insisted, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. The board approved a proposal whose legal validity was contingent on securing all necessary consents, I corrected. A contingency that was never fulfilled, because I never provided my consent as the majority holder of Class B shares. Olivia glanced between us, clearly struggling to follow the technical aspects of the conversation, but sensing the fundamental power shift occurring. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach again, a gesture that now seemed less about the unborn child and more about her own suddenly precarious position. Eleanor, meanwhile, was watching the scene unfold with an expression I had rarely witnessed. On her composed features, satisfaction. She reached for her wine glass, the substantial diamond on her right hand catching the light as she did so. That ring, her own mother-in-law's, symbolized the matriarchal power that had always operated beneath the surface of the Blackwood patriarchy. A power I had studied and learned from over 20 years as her daughter-in-law. This is corporate terrorism, James declared, abandoning any pretense of calm. You've been plotting this. This coup behind my back while pretending to support my vision for the company. I noted with detached interest how quickly he pivoted to portraying himself as the victim, a tactic he had employed whenever challenged throughout our marriage. The psychological architecture of his self-image required him to be both brilliant and betrayed, rather than simply wrong. On the contrary, I replied, maintaining my composure, I've been actively supporting, and often, creating the vision for Blackwood hospitality all these years. The only fiction was allowing you to believe you were the sole architect of that vision. Thomas cleared his throat, drawing surprised attention from everyone at the table. My brother-in-law rarely inserted himself into confrontations, particularly those involving the business. The redesign of the London property, he said quietly. That was your concept, wasn't it, Victoria? The incorporation of the historical elements with modern functionality. James always claimed credit, but I remember you showing Eleanor the preliminary sketches months before James announced the project. Eleanor nodded, a small but significant gesture of confirmation. The Barcelona acquisition, too, Amelia added, her analytical mind clearly reassessing years of family lore through this new lens. Dad said it was his discovery, but it was during Mom's research trip for her architectural preservation initiative. I remember because you brought us back those custom espadrilles from the workshop next door to the property. One by one, the pivotal moments in Blackwood hospitality's ascendancy were being reattributed from James to me. Each success that had built his reputation as a visionary hotelier revealed as my creation. James's hand clenched around his water glass, his knuckles whitening with pressure. The crystal, a set I had commissioned from a small Venetian workshop, reflected the tensions rippling through the room, distorting the light like truth bent through the prism of James's narrative. "This is absurd," he finally managed, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage. "A few design suggestions don't constitute corporate leadership. I made the decisions that built this company into what it is today. I took the risks. I secured the financing. I navigated the regulatory challenges. With my guidance," I pointed out gently. "Who prepared the briefing documents before every board meeting? Who reviewed the financial projections? Who identified the critical issues requiring board attention and crafted the presentations that framed those issues favorably?" For 20 years, I had operated as the shadow CEO of Blackwood Hospitality, researching, analyzing, strategizing, and then packaging my conclusions in ways that allowed James to present them as his own insights. I had been the architect, and he had been the front man, though neither of us had explicitly acknowledged this arrangement. "Administrative support isn't the same as executive function," James dismissed, though the uncertainty in his tone betrayed his recognition of the oversimplification. "Is that what you call it when I restructured the debt financing for the Miami property during the recession?" I asked, my voice still calm despite the escalating tension. "When I negotiated the management contract with Sheikh Abdullah that gave us entry to the Dubai market? When I identified the regulatory pathway for the Singapore property that saved 6 months of delays and millions in consulting fees?" Each example landed like a precision strike, dismantling James's self-mythology. Piece by piece, the family watched in stunned silence as the corporate history they thought they knew was systematically revised before their eyes. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights glittered against the darkening sky, much like they had 20 years ago on our wedding night, when James had brought me to this same dining room and promised me the world. In a way, his father had delivered on that promise through the Class B shares, though neither James nor I had understood the full implications at the time. The heavy silver coffee service, another symbol of old-world luxury that James had insisted on maintaining in all Blackwood properties despite its operational inefficiency, was brought to the table by the head server. The ritual of after-dinner coffee had been a Blackwood tradition since the company's founding, a moment when business discussions traditionally gave way to more personal conversation. Tonight, that tradition would serve a different purpose. "Coffee, Mr. Blackwood?" the server inquired, maintaining professional detachment despite the obvious tension at the table. James waved him away impatiently. "This discussion isn't finished," he insisted, turning back to me. "Whatever documents you've unearthed, whatever technicalities you think you've discovered, the practical reality remains unchanged. I am the public face of Blackwood Hospitality. I have the relationships with investors, with partners, with governmental authorities. The company cannot function without me." His declaration hung in the air, the last desperate assertion of indispensability from a man beginning to recognize how thoroughly dispensable he actually was. "An interesting hypothesis," I acknowledged, accepting a cup of coffee from the server with a grateful nod. "Though not one supported by the evidence of the past 3 months. James froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "What do you mean, the past 3 months?" I took a deliberate sip of my coffee, a special blend created exclusively for Blackwood properties by a boutique roaster in Colombia, another of my initiatives that James had claimed as his own inspiration. "Since discovering your relationship with Olivia and her pregnancy, I've been conducting something of an experiment," I explained, setting down my cup precisely on its saucer. "Testing your theory about your indispensability by gradually withdrawing my support while monitoring the results." Confusion mingled with dawning alarm on James's face. "What are you talking about?" "Those briefing documents you rely on before major meetings? The financial analyses that inform your decisions? the strategic frameworks that guide your negotiations? I've been systematically reducing my contributions in those areas for 97 days now. I smiled slightly, watching comprehension dawn across his features, and the results have been most illuminating. The Macau licensing delays, Thomas murmured, connecting dots rapidly. The hiccup with the Toronto renovation budget, the confusion with the Berlin property tax assessment, James's recent string of minor but uncharacteristic missteps, attributed by the board to distraction or overextension, suddenly appeared in an entirely different light. Coincidental operational challenges, James insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Every business faces setbacks. Indeed, I agreed pleasantly. Though it's interesting how these particular setbacks align with specific areas where I withdrew my usual behind-the-scenes support. The environmental symbolism of our surroundings took on new significance as the power dynamic shifted before everyone's eyes. The ornate dining room with its soaring ceilings and panoramic views had always represented James's self-conception. Expansive, impressive, commanding. But the custom details I had selected over the years, the wallpaper, the lighting fixtures, the artisanal craftsmanship incorporated throughout, told a different story, one of subtle influence, of precision, of attention to elements James had never even noticed. Just like the Class B shares that had been within his reach yet outside his awareness for 2 decades. As James's world unraveled thread by carefully pulled thread, I maintained the same poised demeanor I'd perfected over decades of high-stakes business negotiations conducted from the shadows. Years of watching potential partners and competitors underestimate me because of my gender, my role as the wife, or my deliberately understated presence had taught me the power of composure. While men like James expended energy on dramatic displays of dominance, I had learned to conserve mine for strategic deployment. "This is preposterous," James declared, pushing back from the table with enough force to rattle the crystal. A few coincidental business challenges don't prove anything except that we're operating in volatile markets. Of course, I agreed mildly, taking another sip of coffee. Though it's interesting that these coincidental challenges all occurred in areas where you previously relied on my analysis without acknowledgement. Across the table, Audrey tilted her head slightly, a gesture she'd inherited from me, indicating the recognition of a pattern. "The Berlin property tax assessment," she said slowly. "That was the same issue you helped me understand for my international business taxation seminar last spring, the cascading liabilities structure." James shot her a warning glance, but it was too late. My daughter had identified yet another instance where my expertise had been essential to the company's operations. "Your mother occasionally consults on specific issues," James conceded reluctantly. "But the strategic direction and executive decisions have always been mine." "Have they?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with precisely controlled movement. "Or have you simply been the public face presenting strategies I developed and decisions I engineered?" The twins exchanged another of their silent communications. A raised eyebrow from Amelia met with a slight nod from Audrey. In that wordless exchange, I recognized their reassessment of years of family dynamics through this new lens of understanding. "You've grown remarkably bold in your accusations tonight," James observed, attempting to regain his footing through condescension. "I wonder if it's the emotional distress of our situation clouding your judgment." The familiar tactic, attributing my competence to emotion rather than intellect, might have worked in the past. Tonight, it merely confirmed how little he had ever truly seen me. "On the contrary," I replied, my voice as level as my gaze. "My judgment has never been clearer. Emotional reactions would have served neither my interests nor the company's when I discovered your affair 3 months ago." Olivia flinched slightly beside me, her discomfort at being caught between warring spouses evident in her tense posture. What she didn't yet understand was that this confrontation had moved far beyond the personal betrayal of infidelity to something much more significant: The systematic dismantling of a corporate fiction that had presented James Blackwood as a business visionary. "If you knew 3 months ago," Olivia ventured hesitantly, "why didn't you say anything then?" It was the first direct question she had asked me, and I appreciated both her courage in asking it and the strategic opportunity it provided for my narrative. "An excellent question," I acknowledged with a slight nod in her direction. "The answer demonstrates precisely what James has never understood about effective business leadership." I turned my attention back to James, whose expression had hardened into defensive hostility. "When I received the surveillance photos of you entering Dr. Winter's obstetrics practice with Olivia, I had 2 options: react emotionally or respond strategically. The former might have provided momentary satisfaction, but the latter offered something far more valuable: time to secure my position. The calculated revelation that I had photographic evidence of their affair before either of them realized they were being monitored sent another ripple of tension through the room. James's jaw tightened further, while Olivia's hand moved protectively to her stomach again, a gesture I now recognized as her default response to stress. "You had us followed?" James demanded, outrage temporarily overriding his growing awareness of his precarious position. "I had the company's key executives monitored after identifying suspicious patterns in certain expenditures," I corrected smoothly. "A standard corporate due diligence measure, particularly when those patterns suggested misuse of company resources." The professional framing of what might otherwise be seen as personal surveillance shifted the narrative once again, from jealous wife to responsible corporate steward, from emotional reaction to fiduciary obligation. "You've been planning this ambush for months," James accused, attempting to regain moral high ground. "I've been methodically documenting and preparing for contingencies," I countered. "A practice you often praised in business contexts, but apparently find objectionable when applied to our marriage." Eleanor watched this exchange with the experienced eye of someone who had witnessed decades of corporate maneuvering. "Victoria has always had remarkable composure under pressure," she observed, directing her comment ostensibly to Thomas but ensuring it carried to the entire table. "I've always thought it was her greatest strength as a leader." The deliberate use of leader rather than supporter or advisor was not lost on anyone present. Eleanor had publicly aligned herself with my perspective on my role within the Blackwood organization, a significant endorsement from the family matriarch. "Mother," James began, his tone caught between deference and exasperation, "this isn't about Victoria's temperament. It's about an apparent attempt to undermine my authority and destabilize the company through legal technicalities and selective interpretation of decades-old documents." "Is that how you see it?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. Even now, facing incontrovertible evidence of his vulnerability, James instinctively framed himself as the victim of external forces rather than the architect of his own predicament. "How else should I see it?" he demanded. "My wife of 20 years secretly meeting with my father's attorney, withholding critical corporate support, and orchestrating what amounts to a hostile takeover of my company." "Our company," I corrected, gently. "And technically, I can't orchestrate a hostile takeover of something I already legally control." The distinction hung in the air between us, crystallizing the fundamental reality James was still struggling to accept. The empire he had built his identity around had never been solely his to command. Throughout this exchange, I maintained the same composed exterior I had presented since the beginning of the evening: back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands steady, voice modulated. My burgundy Chanel dress, selected specifically for this confrontation, remained unwrinkled despite the hours of tension. The vintage pearl earrings that had been Eleanor's wedding gift to me caught the light as I tilted my head slightly, waiting for James's next attempt to reestablish control. "The legal reality of the Class B shares doesn't change the operational reality of the company," he finally declared, attempting to pivot to practical considerations. I am the CEO recognized by our partners, our investors, and the market. Any attempt to disrupt that leadership would create chaos that would damage all our interests. It was a calculated appeal to mutual self-interest, another tactic I had seen him employ in countless business negotiations when his preferred position became untenable. A valid concern, I acknowledged, respecting the strategic maneuver even as I prepared to counter it. Which is why I've spent the past 3 months meeting with our key stakeholders to ensure continuity during the transition. James went perfectly. Still, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and dawning comprehension. What transition? The leadership transition plan approved by the board's executive committee last week, I replied, removing another document from my portfolio. A comprehensive succession strategy that addresses all operational concerns while ensuring minimal market disruption. The executive committee never met last week, he objected, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. They met at the Unchi Peninsula in the private dining room, I informed him calmly. Gerald Rothman attended as counsel of record, along with representatives from our 3 largest institutional investors. The meeting had been deliberately scheduled during James's golf weekend in Scottsdale, one of many strategic decisions I had made in preparing for this confrontation. Each element had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum effectiveness with minimal drama, an approach to conflict resolution I had practiced throughout my career, but never before applied so comprehensively to my marriage. That's impossible, James insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. Harrison would have informed me. CFO Harrison has been cooperating with the financial audit for the past 6 weeks, I replied. He's been quite transparent about the irregularities he helped conceal at your direction. His immunity agreement with the board is contingent on his continued cooperation. The systematic dismantling of James's support structure was now becoming evident. Each ally he might have counted on had been neutralized through strategic outreach, careful documentation, or legal agreements that prioritized institutional interests over personal loyalty. Olivia looked increasingly alarmed as she processed the implications of these revelations. James? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What does this mean? He ignored her question, his attention fixed entirely on me. You've orchestrated a corporate coup while pretending to be my supportive wife, he stated flatly, anger and disbelief mingling in his expression. I've secured the company's future while you were focused on securing your midlife crisis, I corrected, my composed exterior never wavering despite the emotional weight of the moment. The distinction is important from both a governance and ethical perspective. This is insanity, he declared, looking around the table for support and finding none. Even Thomas, who had traditionally deferred to his older brother in all business matters, maintained a careful neutrality that spoke volumes about his assessment of the shifting power dynamics. On the contrary, Eleanor interjected, her voice, carrying the quiet authority that had guided the family through previous crises, it appears to be extremely well-reasoned and meticulously executed, qualities the Blackwood organization has always valued in its leadership. The subtle emphasis on always served as a pointed reminder that James's father had built the company on principles of thoughtful planning and strategic patience, qualities his son had increasingly abandoned in favor of impulsive decisions and short-term gains. The board won't stand for this, James insisted, though his tone suggested he was attempting to convince himself rather than the table. They understand my vision for the company's future. They understand the company's performance metrics and legal realities, I countered, both of which now clearly favor the transition plan I've proposed. Throughout this exchange, I maintained perfect composure, no raised voice, no dramatic gestures, no visible anger despite the personal betrayal that had catalyzed these events. My breathing remained steady, my hands relaxed, my expression attentive but not combative. This controlled exterior was not merely a personal discipline but a strategic choice. I had observed throughout my career how emotional displays by women in business settings were invariably used to discredit their professional judgment, while similar displays from men were often characterized as passion or intensity. By maintaining absolute composure while systematically dismantling James's position, I was denying him the opportunity to dismiss my actions as emotional retaliation. "Dad's face is getting really red," Amelia observed with the clinical detachment of someone raised to analyze rather than react. "Perhaps we should pause this discussion." "An excellent suggestion," I agreed, signaling to the staff hovering discreetly along the perimeter of the dining room. "I believe traditional Blackwood hospitality calls for brandy and dessert liqueurs at this point in the evening." The deliberate return to established ritual, a hallmark of the Blackwood guest experience across all properties, served multiple purposes: reinforcing my command of company traditions, providing a momentary de-escalation of tensions, and demonstrating to everyone present that I remained in perfect control of both the situation and myself, despite the increasingly dramatic revelations. The head server approached with a silver tray bearing crystal decanters of aged cognac, Grand Marnier, and Drambuie, the standard Blackwood after-dinner selection I had codified in the company's service standards guide 5 years earlier. "Wood. You prefer the Hennessy Paradis or the Louis III this evening, Mrs. Blackwood?" he inquired, maintaining the flawless professionalism that characterized staff at all Blackwood properties. "The Louis XIII would be appropriate for the occasion," I replied with a slight smile. It was Mr. Blackwood Sr.'s preference for significant family moments. The reference to James's father, and the implied endorsement of my actions from beyond the grave, was another calculated element in the psychological architecture of the evening. James had spent his career simultaneously invoking and defying his father's legacy, a contradiction that had created vulnerabilities I now exploited with surgical precision. As the ruby-colored cognac was poured into baccarat crystal snifters, another design element I had selected for the Blackwood brand identity, I maintained the same poised exterior that had served me throughout the evening, never revealing the years of accumulated grievances and strategic patience that had led to this moment of reckoning. As the Louis XIII cognac was distributed around the table, with James noticeably abstaining, his earlier champagne confidence replaced by wary sobriety, I reached once more into my portfolio. The leather case had become something of a Pandora's box throughout the evening, each withdrawal revealing another layer of James's vulnerability and my methodical preparation. "Before we move forward with discussing the transition details," I said, my voice carrying that blend of warmth and authority I'd perfected over years of steering executive committees without appearing to lead them, "perhaps we should address the financial irregularities that initially drew my attention 3 months ago." James's hand tightened around his water glass. "This isn't an appropriate venue for discussing operational matters," he objected, attempting to re-establish professional boundaries now that they served his interests. "On the contrary," I countered gently, "given that these irregularities involve personal expenses charged to corporate accounts, including several related to your relationship with Olivia, I believe this hybrid personal-professional setting is uniquely appropriate." The color that had drained from James's face earlier now returned in a rush of angry crimson. Beside him, Olivia shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether she was being implicated in financial impropriety. "I have no idea what you're talking about," James stated flatly, though the tension in his jaw suggested otherwise. I withdrew a slim folder bound with the distinctive blue ribbon used by Blackwood's financial department for confidential reports. "The Zurich expenditures from last April would be a logical starting point," I suggested, opening the folder to reveal a detailed expense report. Specifically, the suite at the Bourg au Lac charged to the European marketing budget, despite no marketing activities being conducted during that stay. Olivia's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but unmistakable. April in Zurich had clearly been significant in their relationship timeline. "Business development meetings don't always follow conventional formats," James replied, his corporate doublespeak reflexive even as its ineffectiveness became apparent. The Borolac provides an appropriate setting for high-level discussions with potential European partners. Indeed it does, I agreed pleasantly. Though it's curious that no such partners appear in your calendar for those dates, while Olivia's personal Instagram showed her shopping along the Bahnhofstrasse that same weekend. A remarkable coincidence. The twins exchanged another of their silent communications, raised eyebrows, and a slight tilt of the head that conveyed their synchronized processing of this revelation. They had been raised in the digital age and understood immediately the digital trail their father had failed to consider. "You've been monitoring my social media?" Olivia asked, disbelief momentarily overriding her discomfort. "Not actively," I assured her. But when certain financial anomalies appeared in the European marketing expenditures, a basic digital verification process was the logical next step. Corporate due diligence requires following evidence where it leads. The framing was deliberate, positioning. My investigation as professional rather than personal, as responsible corporate governance rather than jealous surveillance. This distinction was crucial not just for my narrative, but for the legal protections it afforded my actions. Financial anomalies can be explained through proper accounting reviews, James insisted, attempting to regain control of the narrative. If there were legitimate concerns, they should have been raised through appropriate channels. They were, I confirmed, turning to the next page in the report. With CFO Harrison on August 12th, who assured me they would be addressed internally. When no such action materialized by September 5th, I escalated to Gerald Rothman in his capacity as counsel for the Class B shareholders. The precise dates weren't arbitrary. They established a timeline of appropriate corporate procedure, of reasonable attempts to resolve matters through conventional channels before taking more dramatic steps. This chronology would be crucial for the board's comfort with the transition plan and for any subsequent legal challenges James might attempt. Harrison should have informed me of any serious concerns, James countered, though his confident tone had diminished noticeably. He did indicate he would discuss the matter with you, I acknowledged, though his subsequent cooperation with the broader financial audit suggests that discussion may not have been productive. I turned to the next page in the report, where a series of highlighted entries detailed a pattern of personal expenses disguised as business expenditures. The Cartier purchase on Fifth Avenue last Christmas is particularly interesting, I noted, keeping my tone conversational despite the personal implications of the entry. Charged to client appreciation, but delivered to Olivia's apartment according to the courier receipt. Olivia's hand moved reflexively to the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the same bracelet I had noted when she arrived this evening, though I had recognized its origin long before she entered the Goldcrest. Corporate entertainment and relationship. Management take many forms in our industry, James replied, falling back on the practiced vagueness that had served him in board meetings when specific questions arose about expense allocations. They certainly do, I agreed. Though the board's governance committee has established clear guidelines for distinguishing between legitimate business development activities and personal expenditures, guidelines that were implemented, ironically enough, at your insistence, following the Morrison Hotel's accounting scandal 3 years ago. The reminder of his public stance on corporate ethics, a positioning he had leveraged for considerable industry acclaim while privately disregarding the same standards, struck precisely the note of hypocrisy I had intended to highlight. Thomas, who had maintained a careful neutrality throughout most of the evening, leaned forward slightly. The Morrison situation was different, he objected, offering his brother a temporary lifeline. Ted Morrison was systematically defrauding shareholders through a web of shell companies and falsified contracts. You're absolutely right, I conceded, appreciating the opening he had inadvertently provided, which is why I was particularly concerned when I discovered the Blackwood consulting agreements with Meridian Strategic Services. James went perfectly still, the kind of absolute stillness that indicates not relaxation but its opposite, a coiled tension so complete it manifests as immobility. Meridian is a legitimate business intelligence firm, he stated, each word carefully measured. Their services have been valuable for our expansion in competitive markets. They certainly appear to be a legitimate firm on paper, I acknowledged, turning to the next page in my report. Though it's curious that their corporate registration lists the same address as Olivia's brother's apartment in Chicago, and that their only client appears to be Blackwood Hospitality Group. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that occurs when multiple people simultaneously process a revelation with significant implications. Ryan has a background in market analysis, Olivia offered weakly, her earlier professional confidence evaporating as the contours of the financial scheme became apparent. He has legitimate qualifications. I'm sure he does, I replied, maintaining the same even tone. Though his LinkedIn profile still shows him as a personal trainer at Equinox until his sudden career change 18 months ago, coinciding precisely with Blackwood's first payment to Meridian for strategic consulting services. The methodical documentation of these connections, payments, dates, addresses, professional histories, demonstrated a level of investigative thoroughness that clearly caught both James and Olivia off guard. What they had constructed as a simple financial arrangement to channel company funds toward personal priorities had been systematically deconstructed through patient, meticulous research. Corporate structures can be complex, James attempted, though even he seemed to recognize the weakness of this defense. Meridian's organizational details aren't relevant to the value they've provided. The board's audit committee might disagree, I noted mildly, particularly given Regulation FD compliance requirements for publicly traded companies like Blackwood Hospitality Group. The reference to financial disclosure regulations shifted the conversation from potential impropriety to potential illegality, a distinction that even Thomas, with his limited engagement in corporate operations, clearly recognized based on his sharp intake of breath. These are complex matters that require careful context, James insisted, attempting to redirect the conversation away from specific financial details. Isolated transactions can appear problematic when removed from their strategic framework. I agree completely, I replied, surprising him with my apparent concession. Which is why the forensic accounting team from Deloitte has been conducting a comprehensive review of all related transactions for the past 6 weeks. Their preliminary findings inform the board's executive committee deliberations regarding the leadership transition. The revelation that an external accounting firm, one of the Big Four with impeccable credibility, had been examining Blackwood's financial records without James's knowledge, represented another seismic shift in the evening's power dynamic. External validation transformed my documentation from potentially biased accusations to professionally verified evidence. You brought in outside auditors without board approval? James demanded, momentarily forgetting that his audience now understood I controlled the majority of Class B shares and, by extension, effective board authority. The audit was approved by the governance committee on October 3rd, I corrected him gently. The meeting minutes reflect unanimous consent, including proxy votes from board members unable to attend in person. The governance committee had been James's creation, a seemingly progressive corporate structure he had championed to enhance Blackwood's public image, while assuming he would maintain effective control through carefully selected committee membership. The irony of this committee now authorizing the investigation that threatened his position was not lost on anyone at the table. Eleanor sipped her cognac with apparent appreciation for both the rare spirit and the methodical unveiling of evidence. Victoria has always had a remarkable memory for details, she observed to no one in particular. Dates, figures, connections that others might overlook? The comment, ostensibly casual, served as another subtle endorsement from the family matriarch, recognizing the very qualities that had enabled me to document James's misconduct so thoroughly. Memory can be selective, James countered, attempting to undermine the credibility of my evidence, especially when filtered through emotional responses to personal situations, which is precisely why I've relied exclusively on documented evidence rather than recollection, I replied, turning to yet another section of the financial report. The Barcelona property renovation budget makes for particularly interesting reading. Specifically, the design consultation services provided by Artisan Concepts LLC. Olivia frowned slightly, clearly unfamiliar with this particular element of the financial improprieties. James, however, recognized the reference immediately, a flash of genuine alarm crossing his features before he could suppress it. "Another shell company?" Thomas asked, his previous reluctance to engage now overcome by morbid fascination with the unfolding revelations. "Not exactly," I replied, maintaining the same measured tone despite the personal nature of what came. Next. Artisan Concepts is registered to Margot Devereaux, the interior designer James has been working with very closely on several projects over the past 5 years. The deliberate emphasis on very closely conveyed precisely what the financial documentation suggested, that Margot represented not Olivia's predecessor, but her parallel, another relationship conducted under the thin veneer of professional collaboration. Olivia's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension to hurt in rapid succession. The realization that she was neither the first nor the only recipient of James's extramarital attention clearly landing with considerable force. Professional relationships in our industry often require close collaboration, James attempted, though the defense sounded hollow even to my ears. Margot is a highly regarded designer with unique expertise in luxury hospitality environments. She certainly spends a remarkable amount of time in such environments, I agreed. According to the expense reports, she accompanied you to property inspections in Paris, Rome, and Bali last year alone, all billed to the company at premium consulting rates, plus first-class travel and accommodation expenses. The dispassionate presentation of evidence, dates, locations, expenses, all meticulously documented in the financial reports now circulating around the table, stood in stark contrast to the emotional weight of their implications. I had known about Margot for years, had recognized the pattern long before Olivia entered the picture, but had chosen to focus on the company rather than confront the infidelity. Now that strategic patience was yielding precisely the results I had anticipated when I first began documenting the financial irregularities that served as cover for James's personal indiscretions. The revelation about Margot Devereaux hung in the air like the crystal notes of fine glassware after a toast. Resonant, lingering, impossible to ignore. Olivia's earlier composure had fractured visibly, her professional mask slipping to reveal the personal hurt beneath. James alternated between attempting to comfort her with awkward pats on her arm and shooting daggers at me with his eyes, as though I were the transgressor for revealing his pattern of infidelity rather than he for engaging in it. "Perhaps," Eleanor suggested delicately. "This would be an appropriate moment for a brief intermission. Olivia might appreciate a moment of privacy." The suggestion was perfectly pitched, compassionate toward Olivia while simultaneously providing a strategic pause in the proceedings. I nodded my agreement, recognizing the wisdom in Eleanor's timing. "Of course," I said. "The Goldcrest Lounge has been reserved for our exclusive use this evening, if anyone would like to step away from the table momentarily." As the family began to rise, Olivia almost too quickly, clearly eager to escape the scrutiny of those around her, I remained seated, my posture as composed as it had been throughout the evening. James hesitated, caught between following Olivia and remaining to attempt damage control with the family. "You should go with her, James," I suggested quietly. "She shouldn't be alone right now." The directive, framed as consideration for Olivia, left him little choice but to follow her from the dining room. Thomas and Vivian also excused themselves, heading toward the lounge area with the careful step of people traversing an emotional minefield. Only the twins remained, settling back into their seats across from me with identical expressions of fascinated calculation. "How long have you been planning this, Mom?" Audrey asked as soon as we were alone, her tone balanced between admiration and unease. I considered her question carefully. My daughters deserved honesty, but they also deserved to understand the strategic thinking that had guided my actions. "The specific sequence of tonight's revelations has been in development for 3 months," I acknowledged, but the groundwork was laid much earlier. "The Class B shares," Amelia intuited immediately. "You've known about them all along, haven't you?" I smiled slightly at my daughter's perceptiveness. So, like me at her age, quick to connect dots that others might not even see as related. "Your grandfather gave me the documentation on our wedding day," I confirmed, along with a letter explaining his reasons. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications. A slight widening of the eyes from Audrey met with an almost imperceptible nod from Amelia. "But you never used them," Audrey observed. "Not until now." "Why?" "Because business success isn't built on legal technicalities or power plays," I explained, absently straightening the silverware that had been disturbed during our intense discussion. "Your grandfather understood that. He structured the Class B shares as protection, not as a weapon. Protection that became necessary when Dad began making questionable decisions," Amelia supplied, her analytical mind already constructing the narrative. "Precisely," I acknowledged. "For most of our marriage, your father and I were aligned in our vision for Blackwood hospitality, even if he claimed public credit for many of my contributions. The legal control mattered less than the results we were achieving together." "But something changed," Audrey prompted, leaning forward slightly. I nodded, appreciating her perception. "Several things changed. The Barcelona acquisition 3 years ago marked a shift in your father's approach. More aggressive expansion, more emphasis on short-term results, more willingness to compromise the service standards that had defined the Blackwood brand, and, more concerning, a pattern of financial irregularities that suggested personal priorities were overriding corporate governance. The shell companies and hidden expenses," Amelia said. "When did you first notice those?" "The initial red flags appeared about 2 years ago," I replied, thinking back to the first anomalies I had identified in the corporate expense reports. Small discrepancies that might have been overlooked if I hadn't been so thoroughly familiar with every aspect of the company's operations. Nothing dramatic at first. Unusual consulting fees, travel expenses that didn't align with known business activities, property renovation budgets with vague allocation categories. "And you documented everything," Audrey stated rather than asked, knowing my methodical nature. "Documentation is the foundation of both corporate governance and personal protection," I confirmed, echoing a principle I had instilled in my daughters since childhood. I began compiling a secure file of questionable transactions, cross-referenced with calendar entries, official communications, and public appearances. "That's why you upgraded your home office security system last year," Amelia realized, connecting another piece of the puzzle. The biometric safe and the new encrypted server weren't just Dad being paranoid about corporate espionage. I smiled at her perception. A secure repository became necessary as the documentation expanded, particularly once I began reconstructing the complete ownership structure of Blackwood Hospitality from the original incorporation documents. "Which led you back to the Class B shares," Audrey concluded, "and to grandfather's attorney, Rothman. Gerald Rothman has been retired from active practice for nearly a decade," I explained. "But he maintains emeritus status with the firm and holds certain institutional knowledge that proved invaluable. The current partners had accepted your father's characterization of the corporate structure without thoroughly examining the original documentation." "Classic Dad," Amelia observed with a hint of rueful recognition. "Present a simplified narrative, with enough confidence that no one questions the underlying details." The insight demonstrated how clearly my daughters saw their father's methods. perhaps more clearly than I had in the early years of our marriage, when his confidence had seemed like strength rather than a mask for insecurity. Gerald was understandably surprised when I appeared in his office 3 months ago, I continued, allowing myself a small smile at the memory. He had assumed I was fully aware of my legal position within the company structure all these years. But you weren't? Audrey asked, sounding surprised. Even though grandfather gave you the documentation? I understood I held shares, I clarified. But I hadn't fully appreciated their significance within the multi-layered ownership structure your grandfather had created. The Class B shares appeared to be a minority position based on the summary your father provided when we merged our financial planning after marriage. He misrepresented your ownership stake, Amelia stated flatly, her expression hardening as the implications became clear. Let's say he presented a simplified interpretation that aligned with his preferred narrative, I suggested, maintaining the measured tone I had used throughout the evening. Whether that was deliberate misrepresentation or simply his own misunderstanding isn't something I can definitively determine. So, what triggered the meeting with Rothman after all these years? Audrey asked, returning to the chronology of events. The Dubai regulatory inquiry, I replied. 6 months ago, the UAE financial authorities raised questions about the ownership structure of the Dubai property, specifically the chain of control leading back to Blackwood Holdings International. Your father dismissed their concerns as bureaucratic box-checking, but something in the language of their inquiry caught my attention. I paused, recalling the specific phrasing that had triggered my suspicion. Beneficial ownership disclosure requirements for Class B equity instruments. A technical term that had sent me searching through the original incorporation documents I had stored in my private files for 20 years. The Dubai regulators were asking questions that suggested they understood something about our corporate structure that even I didn't fully comprehend, I continued. So I decided to educate myself thoroughly before the situation escalated further. And that led you to Rothman, Amelia concluded. I nodded. Gerald not only confirmed my controlling interest through the Class B shares, but also revealed the additional protections your grandfather had built into the corporate charter, protections specifically designed to prevent any future CEO, including his son, from circumventing the governance structure without proper authorization. Which Dad had been systematically trying to do, Audrey intuited. For several years, I confirmed. The 2015 reorganization was particularly concerning, a complex restructuring that appeared to streamline operations but actually created multiple layers of subsidiaries with increasingly opaque reporting relationships. Designed to obscure financial irregularities, Amelia suggested, her business studies at Princeton clearly informing her analysis. Among other things, I agreed. But what your father didn't realize, what Matthews either missed or deliberately overlooked, was that the original charter contained specific provisions requiring Class B shareholder approval for any substantive changes to the corporate structure. Provisions Dad never bothered to read, Audrey concluded with a slight shake of her head, or believed were effectively neutralized through the various reorganizations he had implemented, I added. Gerald's assessment was quite clear. Despite the complex web of subsidiaries and management companies your father had created, ultimate control still resided with the Class B shares. Shares that had been registered in my name since our wedding day. The twins absorbed this information with the focused attention that had characterized their academic careers. I could almost see them reconstructing the corporate architecture in their minds, identifying the critical junctures where legal reality diverged from their father's carefully constructed narrative. So, when did the surveillance start? Amelia asked, returning to the practical elements of my preparation. The photos of Dad and Olivia at the obstetrician. I engaged Kimball Security Consultants 3 months ago, I replied, naming the discreet but highly regarded firm that specialized in corporate intelligence rather than matrimonial investigations. After identifying a pattern of unusual expenses connected to a new marketing director, who seemed to accompany your father on an unusual number of international trips. Kimball is top tier, Audrey noted with approval. Corporate rather than personal. Smart framing. Her recognition of the strategic positioning confirmed what I had long suspected. My daughters had inherited not just my analytical abilities, but my understanding of how narratives shaped outcomes. By engaging a prestigious corporate security firm rather than a traditional private investigator, I had established from the outset that my concerns were governance-related rather than matrimonial. The surveillance was limited and specifically targeted, I clarified. Focused on activities that involved potential misuse of corporate resources or conflicts of interest. The pregnancy was an unexpected development, though it explained certain accelerated timeline elements in your father's planning. He needed to establish his new narrative before the baby arrived, Amelia theorized. New wife, new heir, clean, break from the past while maintaining control of the company. That appears to have been the strategy, I agreed, though it required several assumptions that proved incorrect, most critically, the assumption that his control of Blackwood, hospitality was secure. So the photos from Kimball confirmed the affair with Olivia, and the financial documentation revealed Margot and probably others, Audrey summarized. But when did you start working with the board members behind Dad's back? I didn't approach the board until I had completed a comprehensive assessment of the company's true legal and financial position, I explained. The first 6 weeks were dedicated to reconstructing the actual corporate structure with Gerald's assistance, identifying the discrepancies between legal reality and your father's representations, and compiling documentation of the most concerning financial irregularities. And only then did you start building your coalition, Amelia concluded, recognizing the methodical approach. Coalition building wasn't necessary, I corrected gently. The legal reality of the Class B shares gave me the authority to act unilaterally if required. But effective corporate governance isn't about exercising raw power. It's about establishing legitimate authority through proper process. I wanted the transition to be orderly, transparent, and legally unassailable, which meant bringing in key board members, external auditors, and legal counsel, Audrey supplied, connecting the strategic elements. Precisely, I confirmed. The initial conversations with selected board members were framed as governance reviews rather than challenges to leadership. The external audit was positioned as regulatory compliance preparation. Each step was constructed to be defensible, on its own merits, independent of any personal grievances. The perfect corporate takeover disguised as routine governance, Amelia mused, a note of admiration creeping into her voice. Dad never saw it coming because he was looking for emotional reactions rather than strategic positioning. Their understanding of the sophisticated interplay between personal and professional elements in my approach confirmed what I had always known about my daughters. They possessed not just intelligence, but wisdom beyond their years. The legacy of the Blackwood Empire would be secure in their hands, regardless of what transpired with their father or his unborn son. Your grandfather would be proud of your insights, I told them softly. He built this company on the principle that long-term success requires both strategic vision and ethical foundation, elements your father increasingly sacrificed in pursuit of short-term gains and personal gratification. If you're still with me on this journey through what might be the most dramatic Thanksgiving dinner in Blackwood family history, I want to take a moment to thank you. Sharing this story isn't easy, but your support means everything as I navigate this new chapter of my life. I've received thousands of messages from women who've faced similar betrayals, perhaps not with the same high financial stakes, but with the same fundamental breach of trust that shakes you to your core. The moment you realize that the narrative you've accepted about your relationship has been carefully constructed to keep you in a role that serves someone else's interests. Many of you have asked how I maintained such composure throughout this confrontation. The truth is, preparation isn't just about gathering evidence or securing legal positions. It's about emotional readiness. By the time James walked into that dining room with Olivia, I had already processed my grief for the marriage I had already accepted that the partnership I believed in existed only in my imagination. If you're currently struggling with betrayal or deception in your own life, remember that your response doesn't need to be immediate. Strategic patience isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Take the time to understand your true position, to gather your resources, and to plan your path forward with clarity rather than clouded by emotion. Hit subscribe if you'd like to follow my journey as I transition from being Mrs. Blackwood to becoming the woman I was always meant to be, not defined by my marriage, but by my vision, my values, and my ability to build something meaningful that will outlast any personal betrayal. Tomorrow I'll be sharing the specific financial protection strategies that saved me from being vulnerable when my marriage collapsed. Tactics any woman can implement regardless of her current financial situation. Knowledge is power, and I want every one of you to be as empowered as possible. Now, let's return to the Goldcrest dining room, where the family was about to reconvene after a brief but consequential intermission. When the family returned to the dining room, the energy had shifted noticeably. Olivia's earlier poise had crumbled entirely, her makeup slightly smudged despite obvious attempts to repair it. James's controlled anger had transformed into something more desperate, the look of a man watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate and frantically searching for structural supports that no longer existed. Thomas and Vivian resumed their seats with the careful neutrality of those who recognize they're witnessing a historic family shift but remain uncertain of their place within the new order. Eleanor, by contrast, carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone whose long-held private assessments had finally been validated publicly. "I hope everyone is feeling somewhat refreshed," I offered as the staff subtly readjusted place, settings and topped-off water glasses. "Perhaps we should move our discussion toward practical next steps." James remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair with enough force to whiten his knuckles. "Before we continue this ambush," he began, his voice tight with barely contained fury, "I'd like to understand exactly what you hope to accomplish, Victoria. What is your endgame here?" The question revealed how fundamentally he had misunderstood both my motivations and my strategy. Even now, facing incontrovertible evidence of his financial improprieties and the legal reality of my controlling interest, he still framed the situation as a personal attack rather than a governance correction. "This isn't about accomplishing something, James," I replied calmly, gesturing for him to take his seat. "It's about acknowledging reality, the reality of the company's ownership structure, the reality of your financial management decisions, the reality of our marriage." "Our marriage," he repeated with bitter emphasis. "Is that what this is really about? You're willing to destabilize a global company, risk thousands of jobs, and threaten our family's entire legacy because I've fallen in love with someone else?" The attempt to reframe my carefully documented corporate governance concerns as an emotional response to his infidelity might have been effective with a different audience. Perhaps the sympathetic business associates he'd cultivated over the years, or the financial press that had consistently portrayed him as a visionary leader. But the family members around this table had now seen too much evidence to accept his simplified narrative. "Dad?" Audrey interjected, her voice carrying the precision of someone choosing her words with extreme care. "The documentation Mom has shared indicates systematic financial irregularities that long predate your relationship with Olivia. This isn't about your personal choices. It's about corporate governance." James shot his daughter a look of betrayal, clearly unprepared for her to align with my perspective. "You don't understand the complexities of running a global hospitality enterprise," he dismissed. "Creative accounting strategies are sometimes necessary for operational flexibility." "Creative accounting is a concerning euphemism," Thomas observed mildly, surprising everyone with his willingness to challenge his brother directly. particularly for a publicly traded company subject to SEC oversight. The unexpected pushback from both his daughter and his brother seemed to momentarily disarm James. He sank into his chair with uncharacteristic heaviness, as though the weight of his precarious position had suddenly become physical. "The SEC has nothing to do with this," he insisted, though with noticeably less conviction. "These are internal matters that should be addressed through proper channels, not at a family dinner." "I agree completely about proper channels," I replied, seizing the opening he had provided. "Which is why the comprehensive financial audit results will be presented to the full board on Monday morning, with representatives from the SEC's Enforcement Division in attendance as observers." The color drained from James's face for the second time that evening. "You've involved the SEC?" he asked incredulously. "That's corporate suicide." "On the contrary," I corrected him gently, "proactive transparency with regulatory authorities is the only reliable way to protect the company from more severe consequences. The SEC appreciates voluntary disclosure and cooperation significantly more than they appreciate discovering financial irregularities through whistleblowers or market disruptions." Eleanor nodded her approval at this approach. "Victoria is absolutely right," she stated, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience navigating business crises. "Your father always maintained that getting ahead of potential problems was the only way to control their resolution." The invocation of his father's business philosophy, particularly from his mother, visibly affected James. For a brief moment, the composed corporate executive facade fell away entirely, revealing the son who had spent his career simultaneously invoking and defying his father's legacy. "The SEC meeting is non-negotiable at this point," I continued, maintaining the same calm tone. "However, there are several aspects of the transition that remain flexible, depending on your approach to resolution." "Resolution," James repeated flatly. "You mean my surrender?" "I mean your cooperation," I corrected. "There are multiple pathways forward, with significantly different implications for your personal and professional future." Olivia, who had remained silent since returning to the dining room, finally spoke. "What about the baby?" she asked, quietly, her hand moving to her stomach in what I now recognized as her instinctive protective gesture. Where do we fit in these pathways?" The question was directed at me rather than James, a significant shift that suggested she had already begun recalibrating her understanding of where actual authority resided in this situation. The vulnerability in her voice triggered genuine compassion despite the circumstances that had brought us to this moment. "Your child will be a Blackwood," I assured her with genuine gentleness. "Regardless of what transpires between you and James, or between James and the company, that reality won't change. The family has substantial resources set aside specifically for education and support of all Blackwood descendants." The relief that flooded her features was palpable, a reminder that beneath the role of the other woman was a pregnant 29-year-old facing an increasingly uncertain future. Whatever manipulations or misrepresentations had characterized her relationship with James, she was now carrying a child who would be connected to this family permanently. "That's not your decision to make," James objected, though the protest sounded hollow even to my ears. "The family trusts are under my administration as CEO." "Actually," Eleanor interjected with quiet authority, "the family trusts are separate from the corporate structure, administered by independent trustees including myself and Gerald Rothman. Another detail you might have overlooked in your father's careful planning." This revelation, that even the family's personal financial resources weren't under James's unilateral control, seemed to land as yet another blow to his rapidly diminishing authority. He reached for his water glass with a hand that trembled slightly, the immaculate cuff of his Tom Ford suit revealing the Patek Philippe watch I had given him for our 15th anniversary. "So you've thought of everything," he said bitterly, after taking a long drink. "Lined up the board, engaged external auditors, contacted regulatory authorities, even secured my mother's cooperation. The perfect corporate coup. Not a coup. I corrected him one final time. A correction. A necessary realignment of governance with legal reality, something that should have happened years ago but didn't because I trusted you to honor the spirit of our partnership even if you didn't always acknowledge my contributions publicly. The simple truth of this statement hung in the air between us. The acknowledgement that I had allowed his fiction to persist for years out of loyalty, love, and perhaps my own comfort with operating in the shadows. His betrayal hadn't just been his affair with Olivia. It had been his systematic devaluation of my role in building the empire he claimed as exclusively his own. "What happens Monday?" Thomas asked, bringing the conversation back to practical concerns. "After the SEC meeting and the board presentation?" "The board will vote on the leadership transition plan," I replied, turning to address his question directly. "The current proposal includes James transitioning to a non-executive chairman role focused on client relationships and industry representation, with day-to-day operations shifting to a new executive team." "You mean to you?" James interjected. "No," I contradicted him mildly. "Not to me. To a new CEO selected by the Executive Search Committee, with my input as controlling shareholder, but not my direct involvement. I'll be focusing on strategic development and brand evolution, areas where my expertise has always been strongest." This detail, that I wasn't positioning myself to replace him despite having the authority to do so, seemed to genuinely surprise James. He had assumed, as he always did, that power once secured would be wielded in the most direct and self-serving manner possible. My more nuanced approach to corporate leadership once again highlighted the fundamental differences in our perspectives. "And if I refuse this generous arrangement?" he asked, sarcasm dripping from the word generous, the same tone he had used earlier when describing his planned divorce settlement for me. "Then the board receives the complete findings of the forensic audit rather than the executive summary," I replied evenly. "The SEC is provided with full documentation of all identified irregularities, rather than the selected concerns we've agreed to address proactively, and your termination for cause is accompanied by potential legal actions related to fiduciary breach and financial mismanagement." The clinical precision of these potential consequences, delivered without anger or triumph, seemed to finally penetrate James's defensive shell. For perhaps the first time that evening, he appeared to truly grasp that his options had narrowed to a choice between difficult but manageable consequences, or potentially devastating ones. "So that's it," he said quietly. 20 years of building this company, and you're prepared to destroy everything if I don't accept your terms." "On the contrary," I corrected him one final time. "I'm offering you the opportunity to preserve what matters most: your relationship with your children, your professional reputation, and your financial security. The only thing you're losing is the fiction that you built this empire alone." The truth of this assessment was reflected in the expressions around the table, not just from the twins, whose respect for my strategic approach was evident, but even from Thomas and Vivian, who had witnessed enough of the evening's revelations to understand the legitimacy of my position. Only Olivia seemed uncertain, still processing the implications for her own future and that of her unborn child. The hand that had been protectively cradling her stomach now reached hesitantly for James's arm, seeking reassurance he was in no position to provide. "We need time to discuss this privately," James finally stated, the corporate negotiator in him recognizing when a strategic retreat was necessary. "Of course," I agreed, signaling to the staff who had been maintaining a discreet presence throughout the confrontation. Perhaps coffee and dessert should be served in the library. James and Olivia might appreciate some time alone in the West drawing room. The Goldcrest's impeccable service team moved immediately to implement these directions, a reminder of the operational excellence I had instilled throughout the Blackwood properties over the years. Excellence that would continue under new leadership preserved and enhanced rather than compromised by the financial shortcuts James had increasingly employed. As the family prepared to move to the library for the traditional Thanksgiving dessert course, I remained seated for a moment, allowing myself a brief acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. Not revenge, though the satisfaction of seeing James finally recognize my true role was undeniable, but restoration. A restoration of proper governance, of financial integrity, and of the legacy his father had entrusted to us both 20 years ago. The Blackwood Empire wouldn't collapse with James's demotion. It would flourish under more ethical and transparent leadership. The family wouldn't fracture from this confrontation. It would recalibrate around a more accurate understanding of its own dynamics and history. And I wouldn't be relegated to a decorative footnote with a generous settlement and ceremonial foundation role. I would finally occupy the position I had earned through 2 decades of vision, strategy, and unwavering commitment to excellence. Sometimes, I reflected as I finally rose to join the others, the most perfect revenge isn't destruction at all. It's simply the revelation of truth that has been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. 20 minutes later, we reassembled in the Goldcrest's library, a wood-paneled sanctuary with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather club chairs, and the same spectacular city views that characterize the private dining room. The space had been transformed for dessert service, with the central table arranged with an artful display of traditional Thanksgiving desserts, pumpkin and pecan pies, maple creme brulee, and the signature Blackwood spiced apple tart that had become a favorite among hotel guests. James and Olivia were the last to join us, having taken full advantage of their private time in the West drawing room. When they entered, I immediately noted the shift in James's demeanor. The desperate, cornered energy that had characterized his final moments in the dining room had been replaced by something more composed, more calculated. He had regrouped during the intermission, and the corporate strategist I had observed in countless negotiations over the years was once again visible beneath the surface. "Victoria," he began as he guided Olivia to a seat near the fireplace, "I believe we may have allowed emotions to overshadow practical considerations this evening. Perhaps we should continue our discussion tomorrow, after everyone has had a chance to reflect more calmly." The attempted redirection was classic James, reframing confrontation as emotional to suggest it was therefore less legitimate, while positioning a delay as the reasonable approach of a measured decision-maker. It was a tactic I had seen him employ successfully in boardroom standoffs countless times over the years. "I appreciate your concern for everyone's emotional well-being," I replied pleasantly, accepting a slice of apple tart from the server. "But I'm afraid the timeline we're working with doesn't accommodate further delays. The board presentation is scheduled for 9 a.m. Monday, with SEC representatives arriving at 8:30 for preliminary discussions." James nodded as though he had expected this response, settling into one of the leather armchairs with a casualness that appeared deliberate rather than natural. "Yes, you've made the regulatory involvement quite clear. However, I've been giving the situation further thought, and I believe there's an angle we haven't fully considered." The studied confidence in his tone caught the attention of everyone in the room. Even Eleanor, who had been quietly discussing something with Thomas near the bookshelves, turned to observe this new development. "I'm always open to thoughtful analysis," I responded, genuinely curious about what approach he had formulated during his brief reprieve. James leaned forward slightly, a gesture he typically employed when delivering what he considered a winning argument. "The Class B shares and their voting rights are certainly a fascinating legal artifact from my father's era," he began, his tone carrying that blend of condescension and confidence that had characterized his corporate pronouncements for decades. "However, their practical applicability is limited by several subsequent corporate reorganizations, particularly the 2018 International Holding Company restructuring." I maintained my neutral expression, though internally I noted his tactical shift. Rather than challenging the existence or original intent of the Class B shares, he was now focusing on their current enforceability. a more nuanced and potentially more effective approach. The 2018 restructuring, I acknowledged, allowing him to develop his argument. Precisely, he continued, gaining momentum from what he perceived as my uncertainty. When we established Blackwood Global Holdings as the parent entity for our international operations, all subsidiary voting structures were harmonized under the new Cayman Islands jurisdiction. The board approved the reorganization unanimously, including proxy votes from absent members. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications. A raised eyebrow from Audrey met with a slight head tilt from Amelia. They had clearly identified the strategic direction of their father's argument, even if they didn't yet know how I would counter it. The documentation was quite comprehensive, James continued, reaching for his coffee with the relaxed gesture of someone who believed he had regained control of the narrative. Over 300 pages of legal framework, establishing the new governance structure, all properly filed and executed. The confidence in his voice had grown with each sentence, the corporate equivalent of a poker player who believes his opponent is bluffing and has now decided to call that bluff. 327 pages to be precise, I confirmed mildly, with the key provision regarding Class B shareholder rights appearing on page 294, Section 17. 3, Paragraph C. The momentary flicker of uncertainty in James's eyes was barely perceptible, quickly masked by his practiced corporate facade. He hadn't expected me to know the exact location of the relevant provision, a detail that suggested I might understand the 2018 restructuring more thoroughly than he had assumed. The harmonization provision, he stated, though his tone carried slightly less conviction than before. That's correct, I agreed pleasantly. The provision that specifically states, and I quote, "Nothing in this reorganization shall be construed to modify, diminish, or otherwise affect the special voting rights and privileges accorded to Class B shareholders under the original incorporation documents of Blackwood Hospitality Group, which shall remain in full force and effect regardless of domicile or jurisdictional transfer of any subsidiary or holding entity." The precise legal language hung in the air between us, its implications unmistakable. Far from eliminating the Class B shareholder rights, the 2018 reorganization had explicitly preserved them, a fact buried deep within the document's technical language, but nonetheless legally binding. James's expression remained composed, though the hand holding his coffee cup tightened noticeably. "That's one interpretation of a highly technical provision," he countered. "Matthews has a different reading of the legal implications." "I'm sure he does," I acknowledged. However, Gerald Rothman consulted with 3 independent corporate governance specialists, including Judge Carlton's former clerk, who all confirmed the preservation of Class B rights. Their formal opinions are included in the board presentation. Materials for Monday. The mention of multiple expert opinions, particularly one connected to the notoriously strict corporate governance judge, visibly impacted James's confidence. He set down his coffee cup with careful precision, the gesture of a man recalculating his position. Legal technicalities aside, he pivoted smoothly, the practical reality remains unchanged. I am the public face of Blackwood Hospitality Group. I have the relationships with partners, investors, and governmental authorities that are essential to our operation. Any attempt to abruptly change leadership would create market instability that would damage all our interests. It was his second attempt at this particular argument, an appeal to practical business considerations rather than legal technicalities. The approach revealed his assessment that he couldn't win on legal grounds, but might still maintain his position through appeals to operational necessity. The market impact of leadership transitions is certainly a legitimate concern, I agreed, allowing him this point. Which is why the transition plan includes a 6-month period, during which you would remain as non-executive chairman, maintaining key relationship continuity while the new executive team establishes operational control. The revelation that I had already accounted for this concern and incorporated a solution into the transition plan, seemed to momentarily stall his momentum. He reached for his water glass, using the moment to recalibrate his approach. The board may have concerns about the timing, he suggested, attempting a new angle. Q1 is our strongest booking period for the European properties, and the Singapore expansion is at a critical phase. Disrupting leadership during these key initiatives carries significant risks. The board has already reviewed the timing considerations, I informed him. In fact, they specifically recommended accelerating the transition to complete the most disruptive elements during Q4, before the peak booking season begins. CFO Harrison provided a detailed risk assessment that supported this timeline. Each countermove seemed to further erode James's confidence, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Olivia watched this exchange with increasing concern, her earlier emotional distress now giving way to practical anxiety about their future. "Let's set aside governance issues momentarily," James suggested, attempting yet another tactical shift. "There are personal and family considerations that shouldn't be overlooked. The twins' graduation is approaching. Eleanor's health hasn't been robust this year, and of course there's Olivia's pregnancy to consider." The attempt to leverage family concerns, particularly his mother's health, which had been stable for months after a minor procedure earlier in the year, revealed his growing desperation. He was cycling through tactics, searching for any leverage point that might help him regain control of the situation. "Family considerations are indeed paramount," I agreed, turning slightly to include Eleanor in my response. "Which is why I've been consulting with Eleanor weekly throughout this process, ensuring that any transition plan prioritizes family stability alongside corporate governance." Eleanor nodded her confirmation, effectively neutralizing James's attempt to position himself as the family protector. "Victoria has been exceptionally thoughtful about the personal implications," she stated, firmly. "Far more so than others who have made significant life changes without consulting family members." The pointed reference to James's relationship with Olivia, initiated and advanced without any family discussion until tonight's dramatic announcement, landed with precision. Even James winced slightly at his mother's implicit rebuke. Reaching for an apple tart with studied casualness, he made one final attempt to project confidence. "The international regulatory environment creates additional complexities," he observed. "Our Middle Eastern partners, in particular, have certain expectations regarding corporate leadership and continuity. The Dubai property could face significant challenges under new management." It was a clever pivot, invoking the same Dubai regulatory concerns that had initially triggered my investigation, but framing them as an argument for maintaining his leadership rather than examining the ownership structure more carefully. "As it happens," I replied, "I met with Sheikh Abdullah personally last month during my visit to the Dubai property. He expressed full confidence in the Blackwood brand regardless of specific executive leadership, contingent only on maintaining our service standards and financial commitments." James froze midway through a bite of his tart, genuine shock momentarily breaking through his composed facade. "You met with Abdullah? When? How?" "During the Women in Global Hospitality conference," I explained. "The Sheikh's sister, Princess Noor, was a keynote speaker, and she arranged the meeting after learning of my interest in discussing the property's performance metrics. The revelation that I had established direct contact with one of their most important international partners, circumventing James's carefully guarded relationship monopoly, clearly rattled him more than any previous disclosure. For decades, he had positioned himself as the indispensable relationship manager for key Blackwood partnerships, particularly in conservative markets where he assumed my gender would be a disadvantage. Abdullah would never. He began, then stopped himself, recognizing too late that challenging my account would only underscore how thoroughly he had underestimated my capabilities and connections. Sheikh Abdullah was particularly impressed with my knowledge of Islamic finance structures, I continued, pressing the advantage his momentary lapse had provided. We had quite an illuminating discussion about alternative compliance approaches for the new wing's funding mechanism. Thomas cleared his throat softly, drawing attention from this increasingly one-sided exchange. It seems Victoria has addressed all the practical concerns regarding the transition, he observed mildly. Perhaps it's time to discuss the specific terms being offered? The suggestion, coming from his brother rather than from me, appeared to finally puncture James's facade of confidence. His shoulders slumped slightly as he set aside his dessert plate, the pretense of casual unconcern no longer sustainable. Fine, he conceded, his tone now clipped and businesslike. What exactly are you proposing? The shift was subtle but unmistakable. From challenging my authority to negotiate to acknowledging that negotiation was his only remaining option. He hadn't expected me to know the exact location of the relevant provision, a detail that suggested I might understand the 2018 restructuring more thoroughly than he had assumed. The harmonization provision, he stated, though his tone carried slightly less conviction than before. That's correct, I agreed pleasantly. The provision that specifically states, and I quote, "Nothing in this reorganization shall be construed to modify, diminish, or otherwise affect the special voting rights and privileges accorded to Class B shareholders under the original incorporation, documents of Blackwood Hospitality Group, which shall remain in full force and effect regardless of domicile or jurisdictional transfer of any subsidiary or holding entity." The precise legal language hung in the air between us, its implications unmistakable. Far from eliminating the Class B shareholder rights, the 2018 reorganization had explicitly preserved them, a fact buried deep within the document's technical language, but nonetheless legally binding. James's expression remained composed, though the hand holding his coffee cup tightened noticeably. That's one interpretation of a highly technical provision, he countered. Matthews has a different reading of the legal implications. I'm sure he does, I acknowledged. However, Gerald Rothman consulted with 3 independent corporate governance specialists, including Judge Carlton's former clerk, who all confirmed the preservation of Class B rights. Their formal opinions are included in the board presentation. Materials for Monday. The mention of multiple expert opinions, particularly one connected to the notoriously strict corporate governance judge, visibly impacted James's confidence. He set down his coffee cup with careful precision, the gesture of a man recalculating his position. Legal technicalities aside, he pivoted smoothly, the practical reality remains unchanged. I am the public face of Blackwood Hospitality Group. I have the relationships with partners, investors, and governmental authorities that are essential to our operation. Any attempt to abruptly change leadership would create market instability that would damage all our interests. It was his second attempt at this particular argument, an appeal to practical business considerations rather than legal technicalities. The approach revealed his assessment that he couldn't win on legal grounds, but might still maintain his position through appeals to operational necessity. The market impact of leadership transitions is certainly a legitimate concern, I agreed, allowing him this point, which is why the transition plan includes a 6-month period, during which you would remain as non-executive chairman, maintaining key relationship continuity while the new executive team establishes operational control. The revelation that I had already accounted for this concern and incorporated a solution into the transition plan seemed to momentarily stall his momentum. He reached for his water glass, using the moment to recalibrate his approach. The board may have concerns about the timing, he suggested, attempting a new angle. Q1 is our strongest booking period for the European properties, and the Singapore expansion is at a critical phase. Disrupting leadership during these key initiatives carries significant risks. The board has already reviewed the timing considerations, I informed him. In fact, They specifically recommended accelerating the transition to complete the most disruptive elements during Q4, before the peak booking season begins. CFO Harrison provided a detailed risk assessment that supported this timeline. Each countermove seemed to further erode James's confidence, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Olivia watched this exchange with increasing concern, her earlier emotional distress now giving way to practical anxiety about their future. "Let's set aside governance issues momentarily," James suggested, attempting yet another tactical shift. "There are personal and family considerations that shouldn't be overlooked. The twins' graduation is approaching. Eleanor's health hasn't been robust this year, and of course there's Olivia's pregnancy to consider." The attempt to leverage family concerns, particularly his mother's health, which had been stable for months after a minor procedure earlier in the year, revealed his growing desperation. He was cycling through tactics, searching for any leverage point that might help him regain control of the situation. The false security that had characterized his demeanor since returning from the drawing room had finally given way to grudging acceptance of his vulnerable position. I nodded slightly to Eleanor, who had been my sounding board throughout the development of the transition plan. Her barely perceptible nod in return confirmed her continued support for the approach we had discussed. "The current proposal includes 3 key elements," I began, my tone matter-of-fact rather than triumphant. "First, your transition to non-executive chairman for a 6-month period, focusing on relationship management with key partners and clients. Second, financial restructuring to address the identified irregularities, including restitution of misappropriated funds. And third, a comprehensive succession plan that acknowledges all Blackwood heirs, including your unborn son, while establishing merit-based criteria for future leadership roles." James listened with the focused attention of a negotiator assessing terms, his earlier bravado replaced by pragmatic calculation. "And the financial package?" he asked directly, cutting to the aspect that likely concerned him most immediately. "You retain your ownership stake in the company, though with modified voting rights," I replied. "Your compensation transitions to a chairman's package rather than CEO compensation, approximately 60% of your current total. The family trust distributions remain unchanged, and all legitimate personal assets are unaffected." The terms were deliberately designed to be acceptable if not generous, financially significant but not punitive. My goal had never been to destroy James personally or professionally, but to correct the governance issues that threatened the company's long-term stability while establishing appropriate consequences for his misconduct. "And the alternative?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already anticipated the answer. "Full disclosure to regulatory authorities, termination for cause, potential legal actions for fiduciary breach, and public disclosure of all documented improprieties." I stated simply, "I don't recommend that path, James. It serves neither the company's interests nor the family's." The stark contrast between the two options hung in the air between us, a negotiated transition that preserved dignity and financial security versus a public corporate execution that would destroy both. Even in his current state of diminished leverage, I was offering him a choice that respected his contributions while establishing appropriate accountability. The calculated gamble I had made in Olivia's presence began to pay dividends as she leaned toward James, her hand on his arm and her expression anxious. "James," she said softly, though not softly enough to prevent others from hearing, "we need to think about the baby, about our future." Her concern was genuine and entirely understandable, suddenly facing the prospect of building a life with a partner whose financial and professional standing might be dramatically reduced from what she had anticipated. Pregnancy that had given her leverage in their relationship now created urgency around securing the most stable possible arrangement. James glanced at her, then back at me, the final vestiges of his false security crumbling under the weight of practical reality. Whatever narrative he had constructed during their private conversation in the drawing room, Whatever counterargument or legal challenge he had convinced himself might work had now been systematically dismantled by the thoroughness of my preparation. "I'll need to review the full terms with legal counsel," he finally stated, the corporate executive reasserting itself in this moment of capitulation, "and discuss the implications with Olivia privately." "Of course," I agreed readily. "The complete documentation is available for your review tomorrow morning. Matthews is welcome to consult with Rothman regarding any clarifications, though I should note that Matthews' own conduct may be subject to separate ethics review by the Bar Association. The implication that his personal attorney might face professional consequences for his role in the financial irregularities added yet another layer of pressure to James's already precarious position. Each potential support structure he might have relied upon had been methodically neutralized through my advance preparation. "Is there anything else we need to address this evening?" he asked, clearly eager to retreat and regroup now that the fundamental power dynamic had been established. "Beyond doubt." "Just one thing," I replied, reaching into my portfolio one final time. "The public narrative surrounding these changes. I've prepared a press release for your review that presents the transition as a planned succession strategy, with you stepping back to focus on strategic partnerships while making way for the next generation of leadership." The document I slid across the table represented perhaps the most generous aspect of my approach, a face-saving public narrative that would preserve his professional reputation despite the reality of what had transpired. It was a courtesy he likely wouldn't have extended to me had our positions been reversed, but one that aligned with my goal of stable transition rather than destructive confrontation. As James scanned the document, the final traces of his false security dissolved into grudging recognition. I had outmaneuvered him completely, legally, operationally, and now narratively, leaving him no viable alternative to the path I had constructed. "We appear to be at an impasse that isn't actually an impasse," he observed with a trace of his old dry humor. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," I corrected him gently. "Just everything that matters for ensuring the company's future and the family's well-being, which should have been our shared priority all along." The library had fallen into a contemplative silence as James processed the comprehensive defeat of his position. The only sounds were the gentle clink of dessert forks against fine china and the subtle crackle of the fireplace that cast a warm glow across the book-lined walls. This momentary pause was interrupted by a discreet knock at the door, followed by the entrance of the Goldcrest's night manager. "Excuse the interruption, Mrs. Blackwood," he said with a slight bow, "but Mr. Rothman has arrived as scheduled. Shall I show him in?" James's head snapped up, his expression shifting from resignation to renewed alarm. "Gerald Rothman is here? Now?" I nodded calmly to the night manager. "Yes. Please show him in, Michael, and perhaps bring a fresh pot of coffee and another setting for dessert." As the manager withdrew, James leaned forward with renewed intensity. "You invited my father's attorney to our family Thanksgiving? This goes beyond corporate maneuvering, Victoria. This is ensuring that all necessary legal counsel is available as we finalize our understanding," I interrupted smoothly. "Gerald has been instrumental in reconstructing the original ownership structure and validating the current legal position. His presence tonight ensures we can address any remaining questions without delay." Before James could object further, the library doors opened again to admit Gerald Rothman, a tall, distinguished man in his late 70s, impeccably dressed. In a tailored charcoal suit, despite the holiday and late hour. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of a distinguished academic rather than a corporate attorney, though his reputation in legal circles was legendary. "Good evening, everyone," he greeted with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in any room. "I apologize for interrupting your family gathering, but Victoria suggested my presence might be useful at this juncture." Eleanor rose immediately, crossing the room to embrace him warmly. Gerald, it's been far too long. How is Margaret? Thriving, thank you, he replied with genuine warmth. She sends her regards and hopes you'll join us for the symphony gala next month. The easy familiarity between Eleanor and Gerald revealed a relationship that had clearly continued long after his official retirement from active representation of Blackwood interests. Another detail James appeared not to have known based on his expression of surprised displeasure. "Mother," he began with barely concealed irritation. "Perhaps personal social plans could wait for a more appropriate moment." "Of course, dear," Eleanor agreed mildly, though the slight arch of her eyebrow conveyed volumes about her assessment of her son's attempt to control the situation. "Gerald is here on business after all." As Gerald settled into an available armchair with the relaxed posture of someone entering familiar territory, I made the necessary introductions for those who hadn't previously met him, primarily Olivia, who watched the elderly attorney with the wary assessment of someone trying to determine whether he represented a threat or potential ally. "Mr. Rothman was your grandfather's closest friend and legal advisor," I explained to the twins, though they had met him several times in their childhood. "He drafted the original incorporation documents for Blackwood Hospitality Group and has maintained an advisory role throughout its development." "A role I thought had concluded nearly a decade ago," James observed pointedly. Gerald smiled slightly as he accepted a cup of coffee from the server. "Semi-retirement has its advantages, James. It allows one to be selective about which matters warrant attention." He turned to address the room more broadly. "When Victoria approached me 3 months ago with questions about the original corporate structure, I was admittedly surprised. Those documents had gathered considerable dust since your father's passing." "As I've explained to Victoria," James interjected, attempting to establish his narrative before Gerald could continue. "Subsequent reorganizations have substantially modified the original corporate structure. The practical enforceability of those early arrangements is highly questionable." Gerald's expression remained pleasant, though a certain sharpness entered his gaze. "Actually, that's precisely why Victoria's initial questions were so intriguing. Your father anticipated potential future attempts to circumvent his intentions, which is why he incorporated multiple reinforcing provisions throughout the corporate charter. From his briefcase, Gerald withdrew a leather-bound document that showed signs of age, but had clearly been meticulously preserved. "The original incorporation documents make for fascinating reading," he commented, placing the volume on the coffee table. "Particularly Article 4, Section 12, which explicitly states that any amendment or reorganization affecting the Class B shares requires not simply board approval, but specific written consent from the registered Class B shareholders. Which was never obtained for any of the reorganizations," I added quietly, though the implication was already clear to everyone in the room. "Precisely," Gerald confirmed with a slight nod. "Neither the 2015 restructuring nor the 2018 International Holding Company reorganization included the required Class B shareholder consent forms, an oversight that renders those changes legally questionable as they pertain to control rights, though operational aspects remain valid." The clinical legal assessment delivered in Gerald's measured tones carried a weight that my earlier assertions had not, the authoritative confirmation from the very attorney who had drafted the original provisions. James's earlier confidence, briefly rekindled during our intermission, visibly deflated under this expert validation of my position. "Even if some technical requirement was overlooked," James attempted, though his argument had lost much of its conviction, "the practical reality of corporate operations for the past 20 years supports my position as controlling executive." "Ah, the doctrine of operational precedent," Gerald acknowledged, his tone suggesting he had anticipated this very argument. "A fascinating area of corporate law, though generally applicable only in cases where ambiguity exists in the underlying documentation." He adjusted his glasses slightly before continuing. "Your father's corporate charter, however, contains no such ambiguity. Section 17 explicitly states that failure to exercise control rights does not constitute waiver of those rights. regardless of duration. The twins exchanged another of their silent communications, raised eyebrows and subtle nods that conveyed their appreciation for the legal precision being deployed. Both were taking corporate law courses at Princeton, and the IEI real-world application of theoretical principles clearly engaged their intellectual curiosity despite the personal implications. "This is all very technical," James dismissed, his frustration becoming increasingly evident. "The business reality is that I have led this company successfully for 2 decades. My vision and relationships have been instrumental to its growth." "No one is disputing your contributions, James," Gerald replied with diplomatic care. "The question isn't about past performance, but about legal authority moving forward. Victoria has chosen to exercise rights that have been legally hers since your marriage rights. Your father deliberately established as a check on executive power. My father never intended," James began heatedly. "Your father was quite explicit about his intentions," Gerald interrupted, his gentle tone belying the firmness of his contradiction. "I know because I discussed them with him at length before drafting these provisions. He believed deeply in balanced corporate governance and was concerned about the concentration of too much power in any single executive, including, perhaps especially, his son." The revelation that James's father had specifically designed the corporate structure to limit his authority struck with precision. Throughout his career, James had invoked his father's legacy while systematically dismantling the governance structures his father had valued, a contradiction that Gerald's testimony now laid bare. "Gerald was kind enough to share some of his personal notes from those discussions," I added, maintaining the same measured tone that had characterized my approach throughout the evening. "They provide valuable context for understanding your father's vision for the company's governance." From my portfolio, I withdrew several pages of handwritten notes on legal pad paper, clearly dated from more than 20 years earlier. "Gerald has confirmed these as authentic records of his conversations with your father during the development of the corporate charter." James stared at the notes, his father's intentions preserved in faded blue ink, with an expression that suggested he was seeing a ghost. "Those should be privileged communications," he objected weakly. "Attorney-client confidentiality would apply if these were legal advice," Gerald confirmed. "But these particular notes reflect philosophical discussions about corporate governance principles, not protected legal counsel. Moreover, Kevin explicitly authorized me to share his thinking with future leadership should questions arise about the intent behind certain provisions." Eleanor nodded slowly, a soft smile playing at her lips. "That sounds exactly like Kevin," she observed. "He always believed in transparency about intentions, even when the mechanisms might be complex. The invocation of his father's principles from both his mother and his father's trusted advisor created a pincer movement that James appeared unable to counter. Whatever narrative he had constructed about his father's intentions for the company now faced authoritative contradiction from the 2 people who had known Kevin Blackwood's thinking best. More importantly," Gerald continued, returning to the practical present, "these historical perspectives inform but don't determine our current situation. The legal reality remains straightforward. Victoria controls the majority of Class B shares. Those shares carry specific governance rights under the corporate charter, and those rights were never validly modified by subsequent reorganizations. The clinical assessment, delivered with the dispassionate precision of the experienced corporate attorney, effectively ended any remaining legal debate. Gerald hadn't simply validated my position. He had closed the door on virtually every potential challenge James might have raised." "So, we're back to Victoria's terms," James concluded flatly. "I prefer to think of them as collaborative solutions," Gerald corrected gently. "Victoria has been exceptionally thoughtful about balancing corporate governance requirements with family considerations and your professional standing." Turning to address me directly, Gerald's expression softened slightly. "I've reviewed the proposed transition plan, and I must say Kevin would have been proud of your approach. It prioritizes company, stability, and ethical governance while acknowledging the contributions of all parties. Quite impressive. The validation from Gerald, not just of my legal position, but of my ethical approach to resolving the situation, carried special weight given his decades-long relationship with the Blackwood family. His approval represented a bridge between past and present, a connection to James's father that implicitly suggested my actions aligned with the original Blackwood vision. Gerald has agreed to serve as interim counsel during the transition, I explained, addressing the family broadly. His institutional knowledge and historical perspective will be invaluable in ensuring continuity while we implement the necessary governance corrections. And what about Matthews? James asked, referring to his personal attorney who had facilitated many of the problematic reorganizations. Gerald cleared his throat delicately. I've had a collegial conversation with Robert Matthews regarding his role in the 2015 and 2018 reorganizations, he replied with careful diplomacy. He has agreed that recusing himself from further Blackwood matters would be appropriate given the circumstances. The implication was clear, though tactfully presented. Matthews had recognized his professional vulnerability in having facilitated potentially improper corporate restructuring and had chosen to withdraw rather than face potential ethics complaints. So you've neutralized my legal representation as well, James observed with resigned recognition. On the contrary, I corrected, him gently, we've ensured you have access to counsel with complete understanding of the legal realities. Gerald has recommended several excellent corporate attorneys who could represent your interests during the transition, all with the necessary expertise, but without the complications of Matthew's involvement in the problematic reorganizations. This careful provision for James's legal representation, ensuring he had qualified counsel while removing a potentially problematic ally, demonstrated again the thoroughness of my preparation. Every aspect of the transition had been considered, including protecting James from further self-harm through poor legal advice. Olivia, who had remained largely silent during this legal discussion, finally spoke. What does all this mean for us? She asked, her hand moving protectively to her stomach in what I now recognized as her instinctive gesture. For the baby? Gerald turned to her with grandfatherly kindness, his expression softening. The family provisions Victoria has outlined are quite generous and entirely secure, he assured her. The Blackwood Family Trust has specific allocations for all descendants, regardless of circumstances. Your child's educational and financial security is protected independently from any corporate governance matters. The relief that washed over Olivia's features was palpable. Another reminder that beneath the role of the other woman was a young mother-to-be concerned about her child's future. Whatever calculations had led her into a relationship with her married boss, she now faced a dramatically different future than she had likely anticipated when James brought her to Thanksgiving dinner. Additionally, I added, maintaining the same composed tone that had characterized my approach throughout the evening, I've asked Gerald to draft a separate educational trust for your child, equivalent to what we established for the twins when they were born. Some things transcend personal circumstances. This announcement, that I was personally ensuring financial provision for the child of my husband's affair, clearly surprised everyone in the room, including Gerald, who had not been privy to this particular decision. The gesture wasn't motivated by magnanimity so much as principle. The child would be a Blackwood, regardless of the circumstances of conception, and deserved the same advantages my daughters had received. Eleanor's expression of quiet approval confirmed that she understood and supported this approach, maintaining the family's values even in the midst of painful personal betrayal. The Blackwood legacy had always been about more than money or power. It encompassed a certain standard of conduct that survived even the most difficult circumstances. Thank you, Olivia managed, clearly struggling to process this. Unexpected generosity from the woman her relationship had wounded. Family transcends individual mistakes, I replied simply, though my gaze shifted meaningfully to James as I spoke. The implication was clear. While his actions had violated both personal and professional trust, they would not be allowed to harm innocent parties, including his unborn child. Gerald nodded slightly, a gesture of approval that seemed to embrace both the specific provision and the principled approach it represented. In that moment, he was not just a legal advisor, but a living connection to the values that had shaped the Blackwood legacy from its beginning, values that would guide its future under new leadership. Now, he said, returning to practical matters, with the precision that had characterized his distinguished legal career, shall we review the specific elements of the transition plan to address any remaining questions? As Gerald withdrew additional documents from his briefcase, the dynamic in the room shifted subtly but significantly. His presence had transformed what might have been dismissed as a marital dispute with corporate overtones into a formal business reorganization with clear legal parameters. The strategic introduction of this powerful ally had effectively closed the door on James's remaining options for resistance. The Blackwood Empire was changing hands, not through emotional confrontation, but through methodical legal process, exactly as the corporate charter had intended from the beginning. As Gerald reviewed the transition plan documents with meticulous attention to detail, I observed the subtle but unmistakable transformation occurring around the library's central table. The family dynamics that had remained relatively stable for 2 decades were realigning before my eyes, like tectonic plates shifting after a long period of mounting pressure. Thomas, who had traditionally deferred to his older brother in all business matters, now directed his questions primarily to Gerald and me. The twins, who had grown up viewing their father as the unquestioned authority on corporate matters, listened with focused attention to my explanations of strategic considerations. Even Eleanor, who had maintained a carefully balanced position between her sons throughout their adult lives, now oriented herself physically toward my end of the table, a subtle but significant repositioning. Only James seemed not to have fully processed the new reality, continuing to interject with suggestions and amendments as though he retained final authority over the decisions being made. The transition timeline needs to account for the Macau property opening, he insisted, tapping the document Gerald had just reviewed. Moving leadership during that critical launch window would be irresponsible. The timeline already includes specific provisions for the Macau opening, I replied, flipping to the relevant page. Page 17 details the project management continuity plan, with Zhao remaining as opening director through the first quarter, regardless of broader leadership changes. Gerald nodded approvingly. Victoria has been extremely thorough in addressing operational continuity. Each major initiative has a dedicated transition strategy with appropriate leadership stability measures. James frowned, scanning the document, with the intensity of someone looking for flaws rather than understanding the content. Zhao reports directly to me. His loyalty is to the Blackwood organization and his professional responsibilities. I completed smoothly. I spoke with him last week about the potential organizational changes. He's fully committed to ensuring the Macau opening meets our standards regardless of executive leadership structure. The revelation that I had already secured the commitment of a key director, one James had assumed was personally loyal to him, visibly disrupted his composure. This wasn't the first such revelation of the evening, but it represented another critical support structure he had taken for granted, now proving to be independent of his personal authority. You spoke with my direct reports without my knowledge? He demanded, momentarily abandoning his attempt at collaborative engagement. That's completely inappropriate, regardless of any ownership technicalities. Actually, Gerald interjected with gentle correction, as the controlling shareholder and a board member, Victoria has both the right and the responsibility to engage with key management regarding continuity planning, particularly given the circumstances that necessitated this transition. The legal validation of my actions, framed as responsible corporate governance rather than subversive maneuvering, shifted the narrative yet again, positioning James's objection as a misunderstanding of proper procedure rather than a legitimate grievance. Olivia, who had been following these technical discussions with increasing comprehension, straightened slightly in her chair. "The organizational chart on page 22, she noted, surprising everyone with her detailed attention to the documents, shows the regional marketing directors reporting to a new chief brand officer position instead of directly to the CEO. Is that position already filled?" Her question, professional rather than personal, revealed an attempt to reorient herself toward the business implications rather than remaining focused solely on her relationship with James. Whether motivated by self-preservation or genuine corporate interest, it represented another micro-adjustment to the new power reality. "The position hasn't been filled," I confirmed, acknowledging her question with professional courtesy. "The transition committee will begin interviews next month with the goal of having someone in place by February." "That seems ambitious for such a critical role," she observed, her marketing expertise momentarily overriding her personal circumstances, especially with the Singapore expansion launching its second phase in March. I nodded, appreciating the legitimate professional concern despite the complicated personal context. "You raise a valid point. The timeline is aggressive precisely because of the Singapore considerations. We're prioritizing candidates with APAC luxury hospitality experience to minimize the learning curve." This brief exchange, two professional women discussing legitimate business considerations despite the extraordinary personal circumstances, seemed to crystallize the shifting dynamic for everyone present. It wasn't just that control was changing hands. It was that the entire framework of interaction was being reconstituted around new centers of authority and expertise. James watched this exchange with an expression of confused displeasure, clearly unsettled by Olivia's engagement with the transition plan on professional rather than personal terms. It suggested a dimension to her that perhaps he hadn't fully appreciated, or worse, had deliberately overlooked in favor of her youth and attractiveness. "Perhaps we should focus on the most immediate priorities," Gerald suggested, sensing the tension and redirecting the conversation. "The board presentation on Monday requires several decisions tonight, particularly regarding the initial announcement strategy." I nodded agreement, turning to a tabbed section of the transition documents. "The communications plan offers 3 options for the public narrative," I explained, addressing the entire family rather than just James. "Each preserves the essential corporate stability messaging while differing in how they characterize the leadership change. The deliberate inclusion of the whole family in this discussion, rather than negotiating privately with James, represented another significant power shift. Corporate communications had always been James's exclusive domain, with family members expected to simply follow the approved messaging without input into its development. Option 1 positions this as a long-planned succession strategy, I continued, outlining the approaches Gerald and I had developed. Option 2 emphasizes governance modernization and board-led restructuring. Option 3 focuses on strategic realignment for the next phase of global expansion. All 3 maintain appropriate market confidence while being technically accurate, Gerald added. The choice is primarily one of narrative emphasis rather than substantive difference. James reached for the document with a reflexive gesture of someone accustomed to having final authority over public messaging. "Let me review the specifics." "Of course," I agreed pleasantly. "Though we'll need consensus tonight, as the initial market communication needs to be prepared for release immediately following the board meeting Monday morning." The implicit reminder that his review was consultative rather than authoritative represented yet another recalibration of decision-making authority. While I was including him in the process, the final determination would not be his alone as it had been throughout his tenure as CEO. As James studied the communication options with concentrated attention, His phone chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at it briefly, then more intently, his expression shifting from annoyed interruption to focused concern. "Excuse me," he muttered, rising from his chair. "I need to make a call." As he stepped away toward the far corner of the library, I exchanged a meaningful glance with Gerald, whose slight nod confirmed my suspicion about the likely source of the message. The timing was precisely as we had anticipated. While James takes that call, I said to the others, perhaps we should discuss the Monday logistics. The board meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. at the corporate headquarters rather than here at the Goldcrest. Gerald has arranged for additional security and media management given the sensitivity of the announcements. Eleanor raised an elegantly arched eyebrow. "You anticipate media presence? I thought the goal was controlled disclosure." "It is," Gerald confirmed. "However, certain financial analysts have been monitoring Blackwood trading patterns with increased scrutiny since the Dubai regulatory inquiry became public. The precautions are preventative rather than reactive." Thomas leaned forward, his natural caution emerging. "Is there concern about information leakage before the official announcement?" "We've taken extensive measures to maintain confidentiality," I assured him. "The board members involved in the executive committee deliberations have all signed enhanced non-disclosure agreements, and the financial audit team has worked under strict confidentiality protocols." From across the room, James's voice suddenly rose above his previous hushed tone. "That's impossible," he insisted to whoever was on the other end of his call. "The trading authorization requires my signature. Check again." The twins exchanged another of their silent communications, raised eyebrows and slight nods that conveyed their recognition of another piece falling into place. Though they couldn't know the specific details, they had clearly sensed that their father's call was related to our broader strategy. "Is everything all right, James?" I called, my voice carrying just enough genuine concern to maintain appearances despite knowing exactly what was transpiring. He waved dismissively without turning, his attention fixed on his increasingly intense phone conversation. "Just a misunderstanding with the Hong Kong office," he replied distractedly. "Continue without me for a moment." I turned back to the family with practiced composure. As I was saying, the board presentation has been structured to prioritize corporate stability messaging. The regulatory component will be handled in a separate closed session with only essential personnel present. James concluded his call with visible agitation, returning to the table with the rigid posture of someone containing significant stress. "There's been a situation with the Hong Kong Stock Exchange filing," he announced, his attempt at casual concern belied by the tension in his voice. "Apparently, some ownership disclosure documents were submitted without my review." "Ah, yes," Gerald acknowledged calmly. "The Hong Kong regulatory update. That would be the revised beneficial ownership filing required under the new disclosure regulations that took effect last month. Victoria signed those yesterday as the majority controlling shareholder. The deliberate confirmation that I had executed official stock exchange filings as the controlling shareholder, documents that would be public record accessible to financial analysts, investors, and business media, represented a critical escalation in the formalization of the power transition. It wasn't just a family discussion or even a board governance matter anymore. It was now officially documented in international financial markets. "Those filings require my authorization as CEO," James insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "The Hong Kong Exchange has specific protocols for executive verification of ownership structures. The protocols specifically require verification from the beneficial controlling shareholder," Gerald corrected gently. "A role that the documentation now officially confirms belongs to Victoria through her Class B share ownership. The CEO authorization is secondary and administrative rather than substantive." James's face paled slightly as the full implications became clear. The Hong Kong filing wasn't just another piece of evidence or legal argument. It was an official public declaration of the ownership reality he had either misunderstood or deliberately obscured for 2 decades. Once those filings were processed, which typically occurred within hours in the efficient Hong Kong regulatory system, the information would be accessible to anyone with basic financial market access. The timing of this filing is suspicious, he noted bitterly, deliberately coordinated with tonight's confrontation. On the contrary, I replied calmly. The filing timeline was determined by the Hong Kong regulatory deadline, which happens to be Monday. The documents needed to be submitted before the deadline to avoid potential compliance penalties. The timing of our discussion tonight was actually adjusted to ensure you were fully informed before the filing became public record. This framing, that the Thanksgiving dinner confrontation had been scheduled to accommodate regulatory deadlines rather than to maximize personal discomfort, repositioned the entire evening as a professional courtesy rather than an ambush. Whether James believed this characterization was less important than how it would be perceived by others present, particularly Gerald and Eleanor, who nodded slightly at this explanation. So it's done, James said flatly, the fight visibly draining from his posture. The Hong Kong filing makes everything official. The Hong Kong filing simply acknowledges the legal reality that has existed since our marriage, I corrected gently. The Class B shares and their controlling interest have been registered in my name for 20 years. All that's changed is the public documentation of that fact. The distinction between creating a new reality and acknowledging an existing one was subtle but significant. I wasn't seizing control, I was simply exercising authority that had been legally mine all along. The difference was critical not just for legal purposes, but for the narrative that would shape both family dynamics and market perception moving forward. Gerald cleared his throat softly, drawing attention back to the practical matters at hand. The Hong Kong filing is indeed significant, he acknowledged, but it's merely one element of the comprehensive transition plan. We still have several important decisions to finalize this evening regarding Monday's board presentation and the subsequent communication strategy. His redirection, gentle but firm, helped reorient the discussion away from James's momentary crisis toward the broader governance process. This subtle shepherding of attention demonstrated why Gerald had been so valuable as an ally. He understood not just the legal technicalities, but the human dynamics that could derail even the most carefully planned transitions. James sat heavily in his chair, reaching for his water glass with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. The sequence of revelations throughout the evening had finally culminated in this unmistakable moment of power transfer, documented, official, and irreversible. Whatever mental reservations or counter-strategies he might have been maintaining had now collided with the immovable reality of public financial filings. I assume the other exchanges will receive similar filings? He asked, his tone now resigned rather than combative. The New York and London documentation was submitted simultaneously with the Hong Kong filing, Gerald confirmed. Singapore and Dubai will follow on Monday morning, aligned with their market opening times. The comprehensive nature of the disclosure strategy, coordinated across all major financial markets where Blackwood Hospitality Group maintained listings, underscored the thoroughness of our preparation. There would be no jurisdictional loopholes or regulatory gray areas for James to exploit. The ownership reality would be consistently documented across all relevant financial authorities. Eleanor watched this exchange with the experienced eye of someone who had witnessed multiple corporate transitions throughout her decades as the Blackwood matriarch. It seems the practical matters are well in hand, she observed, her gaze moving between James and me. Perhaps we should consider how to address the personal aspects of this situation with equal care. Her gentle redirection, from corporate governance to family implications, reflected her long-standing priority on maintaining family cohesion despite business conflicts. It also signaled her acceptance of the power shift as a completed reality, moving her focus to managing its aftermath, rather than questioning its legitimacy. An excellent suggestion, I agreed, grateful for her wisdom in navigating this delicate territory. The family communication strategy is outlined in Section 3 of the transition documents. I've drafted personal letters to key family associates, explaining the leadership changes in terms that preserve dignity while acknowledging the new reality. The existence of these letters, prepared in advance and carefully crafted to manage the social implications of the corporate transition, demonstrated yet again the comprehensive nature of my preparation. It wasn't simply the business mechanics I had considered, but the complex web of personal relationships and social standing that would be affected by these changes. James stared at the transition binder with the hollow gaze of someone finally confronting an irreversible reality. The Hong Kong filing had served as the definitive power shift moment, the point at which theoretical legal arguments and corporate governance principles had transformed into documented financial market reality. Whatever resistance or counter-strategy he might have been contemplating had now been rendered effectively moot by the public nature of the ownership disclosure. The Blackwood empire, the corporate identity he had claimed as exclusively his own for 2 decades, was now officially recognized as mine to direct. The power had shifted, not through emotional confrontation or legal technicality, but through the incontrovertible documentation of financial market filings that would be visible to every investor, analyst, partner, and competitor by Monday morning. The king had not been dethroned, he had simply been revealed to have never legitimately worn the crown at all. 3 weeks after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackwood Hospitality Group's executive office, the office that had been James's exclusive domain for 2 decades and was now mine. The city sprawled. Below, dusted with the first snow of December, holiday lights beginning to twinkle against the early winter dusk. The transition had proceeded with surprising smoothness, a testament to the thoroughness of my preparation and the fundamental resilience of the organization James and I had built together. The board meeting that Monday had unfolded exactly as planned. The executive committee's presentation of the financial audit findings had been met with appropriate concern but not panic, precisely the balanced reaction we had hoped to achieve. James had played his part with unexpected grace, presenting the leadership transition as a planned succession strategy, aligned with his desire to focus on strategic partnerships rather than day-to-day operations. If any board members suspected, the carefully crafted narrative concealed a more complex reality. They kept those suspicions to themselves, recognizing that corporate stability was in everyone's best interest. The market had responded positively to the announced changes. Blackwood stock had initially dipped on the news, as anticipated by our financial advisors, but had rebounded strongly after analyst calls where I outlined the strategic vision for the company's next phase of growth. By the end of the week, share prices had stabilized at levels slightly above pre-announcement values, a remarkable achievement given the significance of the leadership changes. Behind me, the door opened quietly, and Eleanor entered, elegant as always in a tailored wool suit that complemented the winter landscape outside. Since the transition, she had become a more frequent visitor to headquarters, her institutional knowledge and social connections proving invaluable as we navigated the complex web of relationships that underpinned the Blackwood business world. The Tokyo Partnership Agreement arrived, she announced, placing a leather portfolio on the desk. James's desk once, now mine. Though I'd already commissioned a replacement better suited to my proportions and preferences. Signed by Nakamura himself, with a personal note expressing his confidence in your leadership. I smiled slightly, appreciating the significance of this endorsement. Hiroshi Nakamura, the notoriously traditional Japanese hotel magnate, had been one of James's most jealously guarded business relationships. His willingness to not only continue but enthusiastically expand our partnership under my leadership represented another domino falling in the establishment of the new order. I understand James met with Sheikh Abdullah in Dubai yesterday, I noted, turning from the window to face Eleanor directly. How did that go? She nodded, settling into one of the visitor chairs with the ease of someone who belonged there. Surprisingly well, according to Thomas, who joined them. James was professional and focused on the partnership aspects as outlined in the transition plan. The sheikh apparently remarked that he was pleased to see Blackwood embracing a more balanced leadership approach. This report, that James was fulfilling his new role as non-executive chairman with professionalism rather than resentment, represented perhaps the most unexpected development of the transition period. Whether motivated by resignation to the inevitable, concern for his reputation, or genuine recognition of his past misconduct, he had embraced the narrative we had constructed with more conviction than I had dared hope. "And Olivia?" I asked. The personal implications of our Thanksgiving confrontation never entirely separate from the corporate ones. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "She's relocated to the Singapore office as planned. The regional marketing role seems to suit her talents, and the distance from New York provides helpful space for everyone involved." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "James visits every other week. They appear to be working toward some form of stable relationship before the baby arrives." I nodded, neither pleased nor disturbed by this information. From the beginning, my goal had been correction rather than destruction, addressing the governance failures and personal betrayals without unnecessarily punishing innocent parties or destroying value that benefited all stakeholders. Olivia's pregnancy had complicated the ethical landscape, introducing considerations that transcended my personal hurt or corporate authority. "The educational trust paperwork is complete," I informed Eleanor, referencing the provision I had established for James and Olivia's unborn child. "Gerald has arranged for it to be funded immediately rather than waiting for the birth." He felt that provided additional security given the circumstances. Eleanor's approval was evident in her slight smile. "That's very much in keeping with how Kevin would have handled things," she observed, invoking her late husband's principled approach. "Family obligations transcend personal grievances." The mention of James's father brought to mind the letter I had received from him on my wedding day, the one accompanying the Class B share documentation that had remained unopened in my personal safe for so many years. I had finally read it fully only after discovering James's affair, finding in its pages both validation and guidance that had shaped my approach to the current situation. "I've been reflecting on something your husband wrote in his letter to me," I said, moving to sit across from Eleanor rather than behind the imposing desk. "He said that true power lies not in control but in cultivation, in nurturing something that outlasts your direct involvement." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with recognition. One of his favorite principles. He believed businesses, like gardens, flourish best with attentive care rather than domineering control. It's why he structured the company with distributed authority rather than concentrated power, despite the prevailing corporate wisdom of his era. James never fully embraced that philosophy, I observed, stating what we both knew but had rarely articulated directly. He viewed leadership as command rather than stewardship. A perspective that served him well in certain contexts but limited his vision in others, Eleanor agreed diplomatically. "My son has many strengths, but balanced perspective has never been among them." The gentle critique, from a mother who had consistently supported both her sons while recognizing their limitations, carried a weight no harsher assessment could have achieved. It also reflected the remarkable recalibration of family dynamics that had occurred since Thanksgiving, with truth now acknowledged where fiction had previously prevailed. "The twins arrive home from Princeton this weekend," I noted, transitioning to more immediate family matters. "They've asked for a family dinner on Sunday, all of us, including James. They feel it's important to establish a new normal rather than pretending the past month hasn't happened." Eleanor's approval was evident in her slight nod. "They're showing remarkable maturity. It can't be easy navigating their father's choices and their parents' changed relationship, especially while managing their academic responsibilities." "They're their grandfather's granddaughters," I replied with a smile. "Principled, pragmatic, and surprisingly adept at separating personal feelings from practical necessities. The twins had indeed demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout the transition, accepting the revealed realities about their family and the company with a maturity that belied their 19 years. Their primary concern had been ensuring that the Blackwood legacy they would someday inherit remained intact, despite the governance corrections and leadership changes, a perspective that aligned perfectly with my own priorities. A soft chime from my computer announced an incoming video call from the Singapore office. That would be the regional directors' meeting, I noted, glancing at the elegant watch that had replaced the Patek Philippe I had returned to James as part of our personal disentanglement. Would you like to stay? Eleanor rose with graceful efficiency. I'll leave you to it. I have a foundation meeting downtown anyway. She paused at the door, turning back with an expression of quiet appreciation. Victoria, what you've accomplished these past weeks, stabilizing the company, preserving the family relationships, maintaining our standing in the business community, it's quite remarkable. Kevin would have been so proud of how you've protected his legacy. The validation, from the woman who had known Kevin Blackwood better than anyone, who had witnessed the company's growth from its earliest days, carried a weight no corporate accolade or financial success could match. It confirmed that my actions, however difficult and potentially divisive, had aligned with the foundational values upon which the Blackwood empire had been built. After Eleanor departed, I moved behind the desk to accept the video call, conscious of the symbolism inherent in occupying this space that had for so long represented the pinnacle of authority within the Blackwood organization. The regional directors appeared on screen one by one: Singapore, Dubai, London, Los Angeles, and finally Hong Kong, where a new director had recently been appointed as part of the transition reorganization. Good morning from Singapore, good evening from New York, I began, using the standard greeting that acknowledged our global footprint. Thank you all for accommodating the adjusted schedule. Today we'll be reviewing the Q1 projections and the strategic initiatives outlined in last week's planning document. As I guided the meeting with the focused efficiency that had characterized my management style throughout my career, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 3 months. When I had received those first surveillance photos of James and Olivia entering the obstetrician's office, my initial reaction had been deeply personal: hurt, betrayal, anger at the deception that had apparently been unfolding behind my back. But almost immediately, that personal response had been superseded by a more fundamental concern. What did this pattern of deception mean for the company we had built together? For the employees whose livelihoods depended on our sound governance? For the legacy James's father had entrusted to us both? That shift, from personal grievance to institutional responsibility, had guided every decision I'd made subsequently. The forensic accounting review, the legal consultation with Gerald, the strategic engagement with key board members, all had been undertaken not as revenge for personal betrayal, but as necessary corrections to governance failures that threatened something larger than my marriage or my pride. Now, as I reviewed expansion plans with directors spread across 4 continents, I realized that the true victory wasn't in exposing James's infidelity, or even in assuming control of the company. It was in preserving and strengthening an institution that provided value to thousands of employees, partners, and communities worldwide. The power shift hadn't been about personal vindication, but about institutional protection. As the meeting concluded and the screens darkened one by one, I turned back to the window, watching as the city lights intensified against the deepening dusk. The Blackwood Empire hadn't been destroyed by James's misconduct or my response to it. It had been recalibrated, strengthened, and positioned for more sustainable growth under more ethical governance. James hadn't lost everything, despite his worst fears that night at the Thanksgiving table. He retained his position as non-executive chairman, his public reputation professionally managed through our careful transition narrative, and his financial security preserved through his continuing ownership stake. Most importantly, he maintained his connection to his daughters, who had demonstrated a mature understanding of the complex human realities behind the corporate restructuring. Olivia hadn't been punished for her role in James's betrayal, instead finding herself in a position that better matched her professional capabilities while providing appropriate distance from the emotional complexities of the New York headquarters. Her child would be welcomed into the Blackwood family with all the advantages and opportunities afforded to any family member, regardless of the circumstances of conception. And I had neither surrendered to betrayal nor succumbed to vindictive destruction. Instead, I had navigated a path that honored both personal dignity and institutional responsibility, revealing truths that needed to be acknowledged while preserving values that deserved to be protected. The perfect revenge, I reflected as I gathered my materials for the next meeting, isn't about destruction at all. It's about restoration, returning things to their proper order, realigning reality with truth, and ensuring that what matters most survives even the most painful betrayals. Sometimes, the most powerful response to deception isn't exposing the lie, but revealing the truth that has been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The truth that the Blackwood Empire had always been built on more than one person's vision or authority. The truth that governance matters more than titles, that principles outlast personalities, and that legacies are built on foundations stronger than any individual's ambition. As I left the office to meet with the design team for the new Paris property, a project that would now proceed under my direct vision rather than James's reluctant approval, I carried with me not the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet confidence of restoration. The betrayal that had begun this journey had led not to destruction, but to renewal, of the company, of the family's values, and of my own understanding of power and its proper application. The empire hadn't fallen. It had simply returned to its true foundation, stronger and more authentic than before. And in that transformation lay the most perfect revenge of all. Not the destruction of what had been, but the revelation of what should always have been. The Blackwood legacy would continue, not despite this chapter, but because of it. Built now on truth rather than fiction, on shared vision rather than singular control, on the principles that had always been meant to guide it. Sometimes the most devastating response to betrayal isn't matching deception with destruction, but meeting it with truth, dignity, and the patient revelation of reality that has been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.